Hey there, welcome back to Bedtime Story. I know many of you listen to these videos as you fall asleep, so before you settle in, I'd really love to hear where you're tuning in from. And if these stories have been keeping you company at night, leaving a like and subscribing would mean a lot. Now, let's relax, get cozy, take a slow breath, and begin. In this new story, true scary hiking stories from deep Appalachia. The Appalachian Trail near the town of Damascus, Virginia, remained a favored destination for experienced hikers during the spring of 2016. Thomas Miller was a 32-year-old civil engineer who spent his weekends navigating the more isolated ridgelines of the Blue Ridge Mountains. He arrived at the trailhead with the intention of completing a 40-mile loop through the high country over 3 days. Local dispatch logs indicated that the weather conditions were favorable when Thomas first set out into the dense timber and rocky terrain. The initial stretch of the journey followed a well-marked path that climbed steadily toward the limestone cliffs overlooking the valley below. The forest canopy in this region of the southern mountains was known for its ability to block out almost all natural sunlight even during the midday hours. Thomas noted in his personal logs that the atmosphere felt unusually heavy as he crossed the state line into a less traveled wilderness sector. State records from 2016 show that the local wildlife populations were stable and there were no reports of aggressive bear activity in the vicinity. He reached the first elevation marker by late afternoon and prepared to transition into the deeper drainage basins that defined the central loop. The trail narrowed significantly here as the hardwoods gave way to ancient hemlocks and thick blankets of damp mountain laurel. By the second afternoon, Thomas reportedly reached a section of the forest where the undergrowth became significantly more dense and difficult to navigate. State records from that period noted that several hikers had previously reported feeling a sense of disorientation while passing through this specific drainage basin. He decided to establish a temporary camp near a small creek that was not clearly marked on his primary topographic map. Investigators later found archived notes suggesting that the topography in this region often shifted due to seasonal runoff and minor geological movements. Thomas settled into his tent as the sun began to set behind the jagged peaks of the surrounding mountain range. The temperature dropped rapidly as the shadows stretched across the creek bed and the sounds of the local bird population went completely silent. Thomas started a small fire using dry wood he gathered from the perimeter of his camp to maintain some level of visibility. He felt a persistent sensation of being watched from the dark tree line, but he attributed the feeling to the isolation of the deep woods. Archived notes from a forestry survey conducted in 2012 mentioned that the acoustics in this valley could create strange echoes. Thomas finished his meal and extinguished the fire before retreating into the safety of his reinforced nylon tent for the evening. The silence of the high wilderness was interrupted by what Thomas described as rhythmic thudding sounds originating from the heavy brush nearby. He remained inside his sleeping bag while observing the thin fabric of the tent for any signs of external movement or shadows. County files from 2016 contain a brief statement from a witness who claimed to hear unusual vocalizations in that general area. These accounts were never confirmed by local authorities who searched the site for evidence of large predators or unauthorized human encampments. Thomas stayed awake for several hours while the sounds continued to move in a slow circle around his immediate campsite. At approximately 2 in the morning, the rhythmic thudding stopped and was replaced by the sound of heavy objects being dragged across the rocky soil. Thomas reached for his flashlight, but he hesitated to turn it on because he did not want to reveal his exact position. The dragging sound moved toward the creek and then circled back toward the rear of the tent where his food bag hung. Dispatch logs from that night showed no other hikers were registered in that specific 5-mile radius of the wilderness area. The unknown entity seemed to move with a calculated precision that did not match the typical scavenging patterns of a black bear. Thomas gripped his small folding knife while listening to the sound of heavy breathing just a few feet from his head. As the first light of dawn appeared, the sounds abruptly ceased, and Thomas emerged from his tent to inspect the surrounding perimeter. He reportedly found several heavy stones that had been moved from the creek bed and placed in a straight line near his gear. Some locals claimed that this behavior matched historical reports of territorial displays by individuals living off the grid in the deep woods. Investigators found no physical evidence of footprints or clothing fibers that would link a specific person to the disturbed rocks or noise. Thomas decided to abandon his original plan and began a rapid descent toward the nearest access road several miles away, is less than Hashone. Zero hash is greater than. The descent was complicated by a thick layer of mountain fog that reduced visibility to less than 10 feet in every direction. Thomas struggled to keep his bearings as the trail seemed to weave through sections of the forest that he did not recognize. The county files from 2009 mentioned a similar case of a hiker who became lost when the trail markers vanished. He checked his compass multiple times, only to find that the needle was spinning erratically near certain rock formations in the gorge. This phenomenon was noted in state records as being caused by high iron content in the local subterranean mineral deposits. Thomas pushed forward through the gray mist while hearing the faint sound of snapping branches behind him. The trek back to the trailhead required Thomas to pass through a narrow gorge where the trail was frequently obscured by fallen hemlock trees. He noticed that the trail markers appeared to have been scraped away from the bark of the trees with a sharp instrument. Dispatch logs from that week showed that a maintenance crew had verified the markers were intact only 3 days prior to his arrival. Records conflict regarding whether the damage was caused by environmental factors or intentional tampering by an unidentified individual in the forest. Thomas reached his vehicle in the late afternoon and immediately contacted the local ranger station to report the anomalies. Search teams later surveyed the gorge, but they could not find any tools or evidence of a person residing in that sector. The official report remains open because state records cannot explain the rapid removal of the trail markers over such a large distance. Thomas never returned to that specific region of Appalachia, and he chose to hike in more populated state parks in the years following. The events of 2016 are still discussed by some hikers who frequent the Damascus area, but the facts remain largely inconclusive. Investigators never confirmed the source of the rhythmic sounds or the purpose of the stones moved during the night. The archived notes from the subsequent investigation included a testimony from a neighboring landowner who resided 5 miles from the trailhead. This individual reported seeing unidentified lights moving along the ridgeline during the same 48-hour period that Thomas was in the woods. County files from 2016 do not include any record of authorized search and rescue operations or aerial surveys that would account for the lights. Forensic analysts examined the stones found at the campsite and determined they were sourced from a geological layer located much deeper in the creek bed. This suggested that whoever moved the stones possessed significant physical strength or spent several hours working in total darkness. The case was eventually moved to an inactive status due to a lack of actionable evidence or criminal complaints. State records from 2017 indicate that 2 more hikers reported similar encounters with rhythmic thudding and rearranged forest debris in the same drainage basin. Neither of these individuals were able to provide a visual description of the entity or person responsible for the disturbances. Local law enforcement increased patrols near the Damascus access points for several months, but no unauthorized residents were ever located. Dispatch logs from that period show a series of noise complaints that were dismissed as wind whistling through the limestone caverns. The archived notes conclude that while the experiences were consistent, they lacked the physical proof required for a formal intervention. Thomas remains one of the few witnesses who provided a detailed timeline of the events from that spring weekend. Investigators later reviewed old county file from 2009, which detailed a missing persons case in the same northern sector of the trail. A 24-year-old botanist named Sarah Jenkins had disappeared while collecting plant samples near the limestone gorge. Search and rescue logs from that year indicated that her camp was found completely undisturbed, with all of her gear intact and functional. The only anomaly noted in the state records was a collection of river stones arranged in a geometric pattern inside her tent. Canine units were unable to pick up a scent trail, and the case was eventually labeled as a cold file due to a total lack of physical leads. Thomas noted that the arrangement of stones he found bore a striking resemblance to the descriptions in the archive notes from 2009. Reported sightings of a tall, gaunt figure in the periphery of the woods began to surface in local community forums shortly after the incident with Thomas. These accounts remained largely anecdotal, as no photographic evidence was ever produced to support the claims of the residents. Dispatch logs from 2018 mentioned a series of unexplained thefts from local homesteads involving only heavy iron tools and basic survival supplies. Investigators searched the higher elevations for any signs of a primitive shelter, but the terrain proved too treacherous for a sustained ground operation. Some locals claimed that an individual had been living in the deep caverns beneath the gorge for several decades without detection. These theories were never confirmed by geological surveys, which indicated the cavern systems were mostly inaccessible to human beings. By the winter of 2019, the region was hit by a record-breaking snowstorm that effectively sealed off the Damascus trailhead for several weeks. When the snow melted, local rangers found that a significant portion of the old-growth forest had been marked with the same deep scrapings Thomas reported. County files documented that the scrapings reached heights of nearly 10 feet on some of the larger oak trees in the gorge. This data conflicted with the theory of a typical human vandal, as no ladders or climbing equipment were found in the vicinity. Archived notes from the forestry department suggested that the marks could have been caused by falling ice or wind-blown debris during the intense storm. However, the precision of the marks led many to believe that the cause was intentional and directed toward the existing trail infrastructure. The case remains a point of contention among local historians and wilderness enthusiasts who frequent the southern Appalachian range. State records continue to list the area as a high caution zone for solo hikers due to the persistent history of unexplained mechanical failures and navigational errors. Thomas Miller eventually moved to the Pacific Northwest, where he continued his engineering career, but he reportedly stopped hiking in deep wilderness entirely. He maintained that the sounds he heard in 2016 were not those of a person or an animal he could identify. The mystery of the Damascus Gorge continues to produce occasional reports of rhythmic thudding and rearranged stones to this day. Investigators never confirmed a suspect, and the woods remain as silent and observational as they were during that spring weekend in 2016. In this new story, true scary February snowstorm horror stories that still haunt survivors. In February 2012, 28-year-old park ranger Elias Thorne navigated the dense tree line of the Cascade Mountains alone. He was stationed at a remote outpost to monitor snowpack levels before a predicted record-breaking atmospheric river event occurred. Elias was an experienced outdoorsman who understood the physical risks of isolation during severe Pacific Northwest winter weather patterns daily. State records indicate that the temperature dropped 40 degrees in less than 3 hours as the massive storm front arrived. The sudden shift in pressure reportedly caused several electronic instruments inside the ranger station to malfunction without any logical warning. Investigators never confirmed why the emergency radio remained silent during the most critical hours of the initial freezing whiteout event. The wind outside reached 80 miles per hour, which stripped the thick bark from the ancient pine trees surrounding the cabin. Elias noted in his logs that the sound resembled human screaming, but he attributed this to the gale force wind. According to archive notes found later, he spent the evening reinforcing the heavy wooden shutters against the mounting heavy snow. Some locals claimed that this specific region was prone to strange acoustic anomalies during high-altitude pressure drops in winter. Records conflict regarding whether Elias was alone or if a secondary traveler had sought shelter at the station gate area. The county file from 2012 describes a series of heavy, rhythmic thuds against the reinforced front door that night. When the primary generator failed, Elias had to rely on a small kerosene lamp to maintain visibility inside the freezing room. He reportedly saw a figure standing motionless in the middle of the clearing through a small gap in the shutters. Dispatch logs show that no other rangers were within 50 miles of his location due to the extreme road conditions. The figure did not move for 4 hours despite the sub-zero temperatures and the blinding horizontal sheets of falling ice. Elias wrote that the person seemed to be wearing a summer uniform, which was logically impossible given the environment conditions. State records show that no missing persons reports were filed for that specific area during the month of February snows. By the morning of the second day, the snow had completely buried the first floor of the small mountain outpost building. Elias attempted to dig a tunnel toward the equipment shed, but he found the snow was packed with unnatural density. He discovered a set of barefoot prints leading away from his door into the center of the frozen forest floor. Investigators never confirmed how a human could survive those conditions without thermal gear or even basic leather winter boots today. The archived notes mentioned that Elias found his own name carved into the ice on the inside of the glass. There is no official explanation for how the frost formed into specific English characters during the peak of the storm. Elias spent the next 6 hours monitoring the barometer, which continued to drop into ranges rarely seen in Washington state history. He reportedly heard a series of voices whispering from the ventilation shafts despite being alone in a soundproof metal bunker. County files from 2012 indicate that the ranger station was designed to withstand much higher wind loads than recorded. Investigators never confirmed if the structural groaning was the result of the storm or something moving across the roof. Elias wrote in his final log entry that the shadow outside had moved closer to the thick, reinforced window pane. Some locals claimed that the pressure caused hallucinations, but the physical marks on the glass suggested a more solid presence. The search and rescue teams arrived 3 days later once the atmospheric river had finally moved toward the Idaho border. They found the station completely encased in a layer of black ice that required heavy industrial tools to break through. Dispatch logs show that the interior of the station was perfectly preserved, but Elias was nowhere to be found today. There were no signs of a struggle, and his cold weather gear was still hanging neatly by the kitchen stove. The county file from 2012 mentions that a single set of wet footprints led into the basement area alone. Records conflict on whether the basement door was locked from the inside or the outside when the team arrived. In February 2015, 24-year-old Sarah Miller was driving through the Oregon wilderness during a massive blizzard. She was a freelance journalist traveling to a small town to document the effects of the prolonged drought on locals. According to state records, Sarah was reported missing by her editor after she failed to check in from her hotel. Dispatch logs indicate that her vehicle was found abandoned on a Forest Service road that was not on any map. The car was running, and the heater was set to the highest possible temperature setting despite the empty driver's seat. Investigators never confirmed why she would leave a warm vehicle to walk into a blizzard without a heavy coat. The digital images on the camera showed a series of blurred shapes moving through the trees during the heavy snowfall. Some locals claimed that the shapes resembled tall, thin figures with elongated limbs that did not match any local wildlife. Archived notes from the investigation describe a strange humming sound that was captured on the final video file found later. Records conflict regarding the presence of footprints around the car because the wind had scoured the ground to the dirt. Sarah reportedly left a voicemail for her mother that consisted entirely of rhythmic tapping sounds in a specific sequence pattern. Investigators never confirmed if the tapping was a form of code or simply interference from the collapsing cell towers. A local hunter found a red scarf snagged on a branch near the summit of a peak called the Devil's Backbone. The county file from 2015 confirms that the scarf belonged to Sarah and was stained with strange gray ash. Some locals claimed that the area was a site of frequent magnetic disturbances that caused compasses to spin wildly today. Investigators never confirmed if Sarah had become disoriented by the whiteout conditions or if she was following a path. Archive notes mentioned that the search dogs refused to enter the dense thicket where the scarf was located that afternoon. State records show that the search was called off after 12 days due to another incoming storm system arriving. In February 2019, a group of 3 college students went missing while camping in the remote Appalachian Mountains area. They were 21-year-old Mark, 20-year-old Chloe, and 22-year-old David studying local geology. According to state records, they had obtained a permit to collect rock samples from a specific limestone cave system there. Dispatch logs show that their last communication was a text message sent to a friend at midnight on Friday night. The message reportedly contained only a single word, which was the name of a town that no longer existed today. Investigators never confirmed how the students reached the deep interior of the forest, given the deep snowdrifts present. Inside the tent, investigators found 3 sets of sleeping bags that had been arranged in a perfect triangle formation tonight. Records conflict on whether the students had time to put on their boots before fleeing into the freezing night air. Some locals claimed that the limestone caves acted as a natural amplifier for subsonic frequencies that caused intense panic attacks. Archive notes from the search team state that they heard the sound of children laughing deep within the rock walls. Investigators never confirmed the source of the laughter since there were no families living within 20 miles of the site. State records show that David's glasses were found resting on a ledge 50 feet above the ground level, clearly. By the time the snow melted in April, a hiker discovered a backpack hanging from a high branch near cave. The backpack contained a journal with entries that stopped abruptly on the night the storm began in February 2019. The final page contained a detailed drawing of a face with no eyes or mouth looking through a window glass. Some locals claimed that this image matched old folklore stories from the region about the entities of the frost. Investigators never confirmed the identity of the person who drew the image since the handwriting was completely illegible today. The county file from 2019 remains one of the most mysterious disappearances in the history of the park. In this news story, true ghost stories people still whisper about at night. Every year, thousands of people report encounters with entities that seem to defy the standard laws of our physical world. These stories often begin in the quiet corners of the American landscape where the shadows stretch longer than they should. Archived notes from local libraries contain thousands of testimonies that suggest the presence of something hidden within the deep woods. Investigators never confirmed the source of these events, but the consistency of the details suggests a very real common thread. Dispatch logs from small towns across the country frequently record calls from citizens who don't know who else to contact. Some locals claimed that the silence of the forest is a warning that something has arrived from a different place. In the year 1897, a 23-year-old woman named Elva Zona Heister lived in Greenbrier County, West Virginia. She was a young bride who had recently married a local blacksmith and hoped to start a quiet family life. State records from that era indicate that Elva died suddenly and was buried before a proper medical examination could be. Reports suggest that her mother claimed the ghost of Elva appeared for 4 consecutive nights to describe a violent struggle. Investigators never confirmed the physical appearance of a spirit, but they did agree to exhume the body for a trial. Archive notes from the subsequent court case show that the husband was convicted of murder based on this testimony. A 35-year-old teacher named Sarah moved into an old house in Villisca, Iowa during the year 2020. She was interested in the history of the town and planned to write a book about the local architecture. Sarah reportedly heard the sound of children laughing in the hallways, even though she lived alone in the large wooden tent. Dispatch logs show that she called the police several times to report intruders that the officers could never find. State records indicate that the house was the site of a tragic event in the year 1912 involving 8 Investigators never confirmed the presence of any lingering energy, but Sarah decided to move out after only 3 short. In the year 1974, a 23-year-old man named Ronald lived in a house in Amityville, New York. He was working a regular job and spent most of his free time with his large family in the state records show that a terrible crime occurred in the house that left the community in a state of trauma. A new family moved into the residence in the year 1975 and reportedly experienced several weeks of terror. They claimed that the walls would secrete a dark substance and that the air would turn cold without any. Investigators never confirmed the validity of these claims, and some locals suggested the story was fabricated for financial gain. A 44-year-old security guard named James worked at the Waverly Hills Sanatorium in the year 2008. He was responsible for patrolling the massive brick building to prevent vandals from entering the property during the late. James reportedly saw a woman with bleeding wrists running through the darkness of the 4th floor of the old. County files from that region contain hundreds of reports regarding the sightings of shadow figures and strange lights in. Investigators never confirmed the identity of the woman, but archived notes mention that thousands of patients died in the woman. James resigned from his position because he couldn't handle the feeling of being followed by things he couldn't see. In the year 1966, a 25-year-old mechanic named Roger was driving near Point Pleasant, West Virginia. He was traveling with his wife and another couple when they saw a large figure with glowing red eyes. Roger reportedly accelerated his car to 100 miles per hour, but the creature kept pace with the moving. Dispatch logs from the local station record that dozens of people saw the same winged man over 13 months. State records show that a bridge collapsed in the year 1967 and the sighting stopped immediately after. Investigators never confirmed if the creature was a warning or a strange animal that had migrated from the north. A 50-year-old historian named Michael visited the Myrtles Plantation in Louisiana during the year 2022. He wanted to document the stories of the 10 murders that reportedly took place on the grounds of the Michael reportedly saw the reflection of a girl wearing a green turban in the large mirror in the main. State records do not support the claim of 10 murders, but they do confirm that several people died of. Archive notes from the plantation describe a slave named Chloe who was reportedly responsible for a poisoning in the. Investigators never confirmed the presence of a ghost, but visitors continue to report feelings of being pushed by invisible. In the year 1945, a 74-year-old man named Mitty disappeared while walking in Vermont. He was a veteran woodsman who knew the trails of the Bennington Triangle better than anyone else in the. Investigators never confirmed what happened to Mitty because they found no tracks or signs of a struggle in the problem cell face. Some locals claimed that the mountain possessed areas where people could simply vanish without leaving a single trace behind. Archived notes from the state police reveal that 4 other individuals went missing in that same area over 5. Records conflict regarding the weather conditions on the day he disappeared, but the search parties found absolutely nothing at. A 29-year-old nurse named Emily worked the night shift at the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum in 2011. She was tasked with checking the rooms in the Civil War-era building to ensure that the tourists stayed. Emily reportedly heard the sound of heavy metal doors slamming shut even though the wing was empty and completely. County files from that year contain several reports of visitors seeing a young girl named Lily in the dark. State records show that the asylum was overcrowded and that many patients suffered from extreme neglect and various other. Investigators never confirmed the existence of spirits, but Emily claimed she saw a figure standing in a locked cell. In the year 1977, a 17-year-old student named Bill was driving through Dover, Massachusetts late. He was with a group of friends, and they were looking for a place to park and talk. Bill reportedly saw a small creature with a large head and long fingers sitting on a stone wall. County files from that week contain 2 other independent reports of the same entity from witnesses who didn't. The creature reportedly had orange glowing eyes and skin that looked like sandpaper, according to the archive notes from. Investigators never confirmed the biological nature of the entity, but the witnesses have never changed their stories since then. A 38-year-old park ranger named David was patrolling the Gettysburg battlefield in the year 2012. He was checking the area known as the Devil's Den to ensure that no one was camping after the David reportedly saw a group of men dressed in gray uniforms walking through the morning fog without making any. Dispatch logs show that many visitors have reported hearing the sounds of cannons and muskets firing in the empty. State records indicate that thousands of soldiers died on that specific patch of land in the year 1860. Investigators never confirmed the presence of residual energy, but David felt the temperature drop by 20 degrees in seconds. In the year 1982, a 35-year-old rancher named Samuel was checking his cattle in Texas. He was concerned about the health of his herd because several animals had been acting nervous during the late. Samuel reportedly saw a series of glowing spheres that danced across the desert floor without making a single sound. State records from the area show that these lights have been documented by travelers since the year 1880. Some locals claimed that the lights were the campfires of ancient spirits, but investigators never confirmed a solid physical. Records conflict on whether the lights are a geological phenomenon or a trick of the dry air in. A 26-year-old journalist named Michael was investigating the Beast of Bray Road in the year 2020. He was interviewing the older residents of Elkhorn, Wisconsin, to see if the sightings had continued into the modern. Michael reportedly found a county file from 2009 that detailed a recent encounter near the old cemetery. The report described a large creature that looked like a wolf but walked on its hind legs like a. State records from that year show that a local farmer lost several sheep to a predator that moved. Investigators never confirmed if the predator was a standard animal or something that the locals still whisper about now. In the year 1913, a 38-year-old night watchman named James was guarding a coal mine. He was responsible for the safety of the equipment and the security of the main entrance to the. James reportedly saw a large winged beast that emitted a strong odor of sulfur and possessed a glowing. Dispatch logs from the local sheriff department show that several prominent citizens also witnessed the creature during that week. The creature reportedly moved with a hopping motion and retreated into the abandoned mine whenever the townspeople tried to. State records show that the mine was eventually sealed with heavy concrete, but the stories of the creature persist. A 22-year-old woman named Kathleen was walking near the woods in Flatwoods, West Virginia in 1950. She was with her two sons and a neighbor, and they were looking for a meteor that fell. Kathleen reportedly saw a 10-foot-tall entity with a red face and a green body standing inside. Dispatch logs from that night record that the group arrived at the sheriff's office in a state of. State records show that a search was conducted, but the investigators only found a strange smell and flattened. Some locals claimed it was a bear, but the witnesses insisted the creature was wearing a dark and metallic. In the year 1955, a 40-year-old farmer named Elmer was at his home inn. He was hosting a dinner for his family when they noticed a strange silver glow coming from the fields. Elmer reportedly saw several small gray figures with large ears and glowing eyes approaching the porch of his. Dispatch logs indicate that the family engaged in a long standoff with the creatures using their own personal hunting. Investigators never confirmed the presence of any intruders, but they did find several bullet holes in the walls. Records conflict on whether the creatures were real or if the family had experienced a collective hallucination that night. A 31-year-old librarian named Jennifer visited the Lemp Mansion in St. Louis during the year 2013. She was researching the history of the family and wanted to see the building where they lived, and Jennifer reportedly felt a hand touch her shoulder while she was standing in the empty dining room of the estate. Records confirm that 4 members of the Lemp family committed suicide within the walls of the large stone. Archived notes from the current staff mention that the attic is the site of most of the unusual. Investigators never confirmed the presence of spirits, but Jennifer saw a glass move across a table without being touched. In the year 1994, a 52-year-old researcher named Terry bought a ranch in Utah. He wanted to raise high-quality cattle, but he soon discovered that the land was home to strange events. Terry reportedly saw large metallic objects in the sky and creatures that would disappear when he tried to approach. County files from that period contain hundreds of pages of testimony from neighbors who witnessed the same unusual activities. Investigators never confirmed the source of the activity, but a private organization eventually purchased the ranch for scientific work. Records conflict on whether the events were caused by secret military testing or something that defies a logical explanation. A 45-year-old deputy named Mark Thompson served the county during the year 2014. His primary duty involved patrolling the back roads to ensure the safety of the residents living in the back. Mark reportedly encountered a large, dark shape sitting in the middle of the road during a heavy rain. He stopped his cruiser and activated the spotlight, but the object moved into the brush with incredible speed, and dispatch logs indicate that Mark requested backup because he felt the situation had become unpredictable and potentially very. No further sightings occurred that night, and the deputy resigned from his position within 3 months of the event. The world is full of stories that remind us how little we actually know about the environment we inhabit. Every county file and archived note provides a small piece of a puzzle that we may never truly. Investigators continue to look for answers, while the residents of these small towns continue to watch the dark. Some locals claimed that the truth is hidden in plain sight, while others believe it is better left. Dispatch logs will continue to record the calls, and the state records will continue to gather the reports. We may never know what is out there, but we will certainly continue to whisper about these ghosts. In this news story, true scary stories of growing up in Appalachia they never warned us about. The Appalachian mountain range contains thousands of square miles of dense forest and deep valleys that remain largely unexplored today. Many residents of these isolated communities prefer to avoid the high ridges and deep hollows when the sun goes down. Jacob Miller was a 25-year-old surveyor who graduated from a technical college in the year 2012. He accepted a contract to map the boundaries of a large timber property located in the heart of Logan County. His objective involved placing physical markers every 50 feet to define the limits of a future logging operation site. State records from 2015 indicate that the project was part of a larger economic development plan for the region. The valley known as Black Hollow earned its name because the steep mountain walls blocked the light for most day. Archived notes from the 1920s describe the area as a place where the air remains cold even in July. Jacob drove his heavy truck through several small towns where the locals watched him with a sense of quiet suspicion. He reached the end of a gravel road and parked his vehicle near a rusted gate that was locked shut. Reportedly, the local utility companies refused to service the hollow due to the frequent equipment failures and the rough terrain. Jacob checked his radio and noted that he was already losing the signal from the nearest tower in the city. State records mentioned that the last official residence in the hollow was a small homestead that burned in 1970. Dispatch logs from that year recorded a series of strange sightings by the fire crews who responded to the scene. Investigators never confirmed the cause of the fire, and the county file from 2009 noted the case closed. Some locals claimed that the fire was set intentionally to drive out a family that refused to sell their land. Records conflict regarding the names of the victims, but the stories of the tragedy persisted in the local folklore area. Jacob ignored the local legends and focused on the technical requirements of the surveying job he needed to finish today. The hike into the center of the hollow took over 2 hours because the undergrowth was thick with thorny vines. Jacob carried a heavy pack filled with iron pins and a sledgehammer along with his digital GPS tracking device unit. He noticed that the forest was strangely quiet, and even the common birds of West Virginia seemed to be absent. The ground was covered in a thick layer of damp leaves that muffled the sound of his heavy leather boots. He reached the first corner of the property and began searching for the original boundary marker from 1924. He found a rusted piece of metal protruding from the base of a massive oak tree that looked very ancient. Jacob set up his tripod and began the process of verifying the coordinates using the satellite data on his screen. He noticed that his GPS unit was fluctuating wildly and gave him readings that were several hundred feet off target. Reportedly, the geological composition of the Appalachian Mountains can sometimes interfere with electronic signals during the summer months here. He decided to rely on his compass and the physical descriptions found in the old county files for his work. A sudden sound of a heavy branch snapping nearby caused him to pause and reach for the bear spray on belt. He scanned the trees but saw nothing except for the swaying leaves and the shifting shadows of the deep forest. As he moved deeper into the hollow, he stumbled upon the remains of a log structure hidden behind some brush. The cabin was built in the style of the early 1900s with a stone chimney that was mostly collapsed. Archived notes from the Historical Society suggested that this was the site of a failed mining office from 2011. Jacob walked toward the open doorway and saw that the interior was filled with rotted furniture and old rusted cans. He saw a series of strange markings carved into the wooden doorframe that looked like a tally of days. Some locals claimed that a hermit lived in this cabin until his disappearance in the winter of 24. He stepped inside the cabin to escape a sudden downpour of rain that began to fall from the gray sky. The air inside smelled of damp earth and old coal smoke, which felt very oppressive in the small, cramped space. He found a handwritten ledger on the floor that contained names and dates from the year 2009. Dispatch logs from that period mentioned a search for a missing hiker who was last seen near this cabin site. Investigators never confirmed if the ledger belonged to the missing man or a squatter who was living in the woods. Jacob took a photo of the ledger and prepared to leave as the rain began to taper off outside now. A low humming sound began to vibrate through the walls of the cabin and caused Jacob to feel very nauseous. He recognized the sound as an acoustic anomaly often reported in deep valleys where the wind hits the rock faces. County records from 2016 include several testimonies from park rangers who experienced similar physical sensations in the area. Jacob walked back into the clearing and saw that his survey tripod had been knocked over on the wet ground. He was certain that he had been alone in the woods, but the damage to his equipment suggested otherwise today. He carefully inspected the area for tracks, but the damp leaves made it impossible to see any clear footprints there. He heard a sharp whistle coming from the ridge above the cabin that sounded exactly like a human signal call. Jacob shouted a greeting into the forest, but the only response was the rhythmic tapping of wood against a tree. Some archived notes from the Regional Forestry Department mentioned that timber poachers used these signals to communicate with each other. He decided to pack his gear and move toward the secondary survey site located on the eastern slope of hill. The feeling of being watched intensified as he climbed the steep terrain and moved away from the old log cabin. He kept his head down and focused on the path while checking his watch every few minutes to track time. He found a series of deep trenches that were dug into the hillside and lined with heavy pieces of plastic. State records from 2003 mentioned that illegal excavations were common in areas with potential for gold or gems. Jacob saw fresh cigarette butts near the edge of the trench, which indicated that someone was here very recently today. He realized that he might be encroaching on an active illegal mining operation that was not authorized by the state. Reportedly, these groups can be very protective of their sites and often use intimidation to keep strangers away from area. He began to back away from the trenches while trying to remain as quiet as possible in the thick brush. He saw a small pile of personal items near a tree that included a pair of child shoes and glasses. The county file from 2009 mentioned that a family vanished from a nearby campsite without leaving a trace. Investigators never confirmed if the items were connected to the missing family or if they were just discarded mountain trash. Jacob felt a surge of adrenaline as he realized the danger of his situation in this remote part of Hollow. He turned to walk back the way he came and saw a figure standing silently on the trail ahead of. The person was wearing a heavy, dark coat and a wide-brimmed hat that obscured their face from his view. Jacob stopped and raised his hands to show that he was not a threat to the person on the trail. He explained that he was a surveyor for the state and was only here to map the boundaries of property. The figure did not respond and simply pointed toward the ridge before turning and walking back into the dense trees. Records conflict regarding the presence of any registered residents in this specific section of the Logan County forest land. Jacob waited for several minutes until he was sure the stranger was gone before he continued down the narrow path. He felt his heart racing in his chest as he realized how isolated he truly was from any outside help. The sun began to drop behind the mountain peaks and cast long and distorted shadows across the forest floor today. Jacob knew that he could not navigate the terrain in the dark and needed to find a safe place soon. He found a small rock overhang that offered some protection from the elements and the wind blowing from the north. He sat with his back against the stone and kept his flashlight off to avoid drawing attention to his location. Some locals claimed that the woods come alive at night with sounds that have no logical explanation for the people. He heard a series of heavy thuds that sounded like someone was dropping large rocks into the deep valley below. He used his flashlight briefly to check his map and saw a trail that was not listed on any document. Archived notes from the 1950s mentioned a secret road used by moonshiners during the era of the Prohibition laws. He decided to follow the trail in the morning because it appeared to lead directly toward the main highway exit. The sound of a metallic scraping began again and seemed to be coming from the woods directly above his head. Jacob stayed awake for most of the night and listened to the strange noises that echoed through the dark hollow. He felt a deep sense of dread that he could not explain despite his professional training and his personal experience. The first light of dawn revealed a heavy mist that clung to the trees and made visibility very difficult today. Jacob gathered his belongings and started walking down the secret trail while keeping a hand on his heavy survey equipment. He found a rusted metal sign that was nailed to a tree and written in a language he did not. Dispatch logs from 2012 recorded a similar report of a strange sign found by a group of local hikers. Investigators never confirmed the meaning of the sign and suggested it was a prank by some local high school students. Jacob reached a clearing and saw his truck parked in the distance, which gave him a great sense of relief. When he reached his vehicle, he saw that the tires had been slashed and the windshield was smashed with rocks. He checked the interior of the truck and found that nothing was stolen, including his expensive laptop and his radio. Reportedly, the act of vandalism was a clear warning to leave the area and never return to the Black Hollow. He used his satellite phone to call for help and waited for the local police to arrive at his location. State records from 2015 show that the police response was delayed by several hours due to a fallen tree. Jacob sat on the ground and watched the forest with a sense of defeat as the rain began to fall. Two officers from the Logan County Sheriff Department arrived in a heavy four-wheel drive vehicle to help him today. They took a statement from Jacob and examined the damage to his truck with a look of bored and indifference. The county file from 2009 mentioned that vandalism was common in the remote parts of the mountain range. Jacob told them about the cabin and the figure he saw on the trail, but the officers simply shook heads. Some locals claimed that the police were aware of the illegal activities in the hollow, but chose to ignore them. He felt that they were not telling him everything they knew about the history of the Black Hollow and its residents. The survey project was officially suspended by the timber company 2 weeks after Jacob returned to the main office today. State records from 2016 indicate that the land was sold to an anonymous buyer who requested no further maps. Jacob never received an explanation for the sudden change in plans, and he was assigned to a different project site. He still has the photos of the ledger and the strange markings he found on the door of the cabin. Investigators never confirmed any of his claims, and the case of the vanished family remains an open and cold file. He sometimes thinks about the figure on the trail and wonders if they were trying to help or to hurt. Jacob Miller moved out of West Virginia in the year 2017 to work in the flatter terrain of Ohio. He avoids the woods and the mountains because the sound of breaking branches still makes him feel very uneasy now. Archived notes from the local newspaper mentioned that several more sightings of the figure occurred in 2018 and 19. Records conflict regarding the current status of the Black Hollow, but many people say it is a cursed place today. Jacob knows that the truth is likely much more mundane, but no less terrifying than any ghost or monster story. The Appalachian Mountains will continue to keep their secrets hidden in the deep hollows and the shadows of the forest. Before Jacob entered the woods, he stopped at a small gas station to buy some water and some trail snacks. The elderly woman behind the counter saw his survey maps and warned him to be careful near the old creek. She mentioned that her grandfather used to work in the mines until the day he saw something in the dark. Reportedly, the man never spoke another word for the rest of his life and died in the year 1960. Jacob dismissed her story as a local superstition designed to frighten outsiders who came to work on the mountain today. He now realizes that the warning was based on a very real and present danger that he did not understand. The survey pins were made of galvanized steel and were designed to last for at least 100 years in soil. Jacob recorded the serial numbers of each pin in his logbook to ensure that the data was accurate and verifiable. County records from 2012 showed that many pins from the original 1924 survey were missing or moved. Some archive notes suggested that the movement of the earth was responsible for the displacement of the boundary markers there. Jacob found it hard to believe that nature could move a heavy steel rod several feet without leaving any tracks. He suspected that someone was moving the markers to change the size of the property for their own personal gain. Dispatch logs from 2015 recorded a call from a woman who lived on the edge of the Logan County. She claimed that her dog would bark at the trees for hours every night until it finally disappeared in June. Investigators never confirmed if a predator was responsible or if the dog had simply run away into the deep woods. Jacob thought about this report as he sat in his truck and waited for the police to arrive at site. He wondered if the figure he saw on the trail had anything to do with the disappearance of the local. The silence of the mountain felt like a heavy weight that was pressing down on his chest and his mind. There are many stories like this one that come from the heart of the Appalachian Mountains every single year now. Most of them are dismissed as urban legends or the result of too much isolation in the deep wilderness areas. State records and county files provide a glimpse into the reality of the events, but they never tell the whole. Jacob Miller still dreams of the metallic scraping sound and the feeling of eyes watching him from the dark trees. He will never return to the Black Hollow, and he advises others to stay away from the deep Appalachian woods. The truth remains hidden in the archives and the memories of the few people who were brave enough to enter. The most outrageous true story you'll hear all year. Long before anyone called it outrageous, it started as a boring missing wallet report in a tiny coastal town. The officer who took the call later said it was the most routine thing on his shift that week. Nothing about it suggested a chain of events that would spiral across states and decades. The guy reporting the missing wallet was 31-year-old car detailer named Riven Malco. He lived in a rented duplex behind an auto shop, spent weekends fishing off a breakwater, and had never left the country. Friends said he complained a lot about money, but never about people. That morning, he walked into the station holding a printed bank notice that made absolutely no sense. His notice said a credit card in his name had been used to pay for an upscale hotel room in a city 3 states away. The problem was simple. He did not own that card. His account number matched, his name matched, even the expiration date matched, but the card shown in the bank photo had a different design than anything he ever received. The bank suggested maybe an error in their system, then flagged potential fraud when the hotel confirmed the guest had already checked out. The officer on duty, a 46-year-old named Dev Harlan, filed the report and told Riven to freeze his accounts. Dev figured some thief skimmed his information online. He almost left it at that, until the hotel faxed a copy of the registration form used by the mysterious guest. The signature at the bottom made Dev straighten in his chair. It looked exactly like Riven's. Dev called him back to the station and slid the fax across the desk. Riven stared at the signature, ran his finger under the curve of the final letter, and went pale. He said that was his handwriting, the small slant in the R, the habit of flattening the last stroke. Dev asked whether he ever stayed in that hotel, maybe years earlier, maybe under different circumstances. Riven insisted he had never even visited that city. It would have stayed a weird identity theft case if not for the security photos attached to the file. The hotel lobby camera captured the guest at check-in. He wore a windbreaker and carried a hard plastic suitcase. When Dev printed the still, every person in the small station gathered around the desk. The man in the photo looked exactly like Riven. They checked hairline, jaw, and a faint scar near the left temple. The height estimation matched within an inch. The timestamp on the photo placed the check-in at the same hour Riven's phone showed him streaming a fishing tutorial at home, verified by his internet provider. Unless he teleported, he could not be in both places. Dev contacted the city police where the hotel stood and requested more footage. A week later, a flash drive arrived with lobby clips, elevator feeds, and hallway shots. In every frame, the man called Riven moved like him, with the same slight inward turn of the foot and the same habit of rubbing the side of his nose when thinking. In one sequence, he looked straight at the elevator camera and smiled briefly. Dev paused the frame and compared it to Riven sitting across the desk. They might as well have been twins. The guest stayed 2 nights, paid in full, then left alone in the morning. No one followed him, no one met him in the lobby, and no one saw him abandon any luggage. The suitcase never appeared again. The hotel only realized something was off when a housekeeper found a stack of photographs under the room's mini fridge after checkout. The photos showed a burned building surrounded by winter trees. Those photos turned out to be from a fire investigation nearly 20 years earlier in a completely different state. The building had been an old boarding house, damaged in a fast-moving blaze. The case file listed no injuries, yet the box holding the original evidence went missing from storage years later. Now, copies of those images sat abandoned under a hotel fridge rented by a man using Riven's identity. Dev dug into the old fire case through shared databases and found one detail that made his skin crawl. A surviving witness from that boarding house fire had given a statement at the time, describing a man seen walking away from the building moments before smoke appeared. The composite sketch attached to the witness report looked nothing like Riven back then. But when Dev scanned the sketch and overlaid it with a recent photo of him, the proportions lined up disturbingly well, like someone took an earlier face and pressed it into an older shape. Riven had never visited that state, not according to his work history, school records, or childhood address list. His family never left the coast. He was a teenager during the boarding house fire, but nowhere near the scene. Yet some stranger just checked into a hotel using his name, left stolen photos from that fire behind, and vanished without a trace. As they dug deeper, the story bent even further. The credit card used at the hotel connected to an account created 12 years earlier in a fourth state. That account had almost no activity. Once every couple of years, it bought a prepaid phone, a short bus ticket, or a single hotel night in random cities. Each time, surveillance video captured the same man who looked exactly like Riven at his current age. The weird part was timing. On the earliest footage, taken 12 years earlier, the man looked only a little younger than Kalen did now. The facial recognition system rated the matches as extremely high. Investigators tested the software using old-school photos of Riven and found predictable aging, but there was no phase where his face matched the younger version on those early videos. It was like this other man always stayed roughly 30, no matter the year. Federal investigators briefly stepped in, assuming sophisticated fraud. They pressed Riven about relatives he barely knew, long-lost cousins, secret half-brothers. His parents swore there were no hidden children. Old hospital records from his birth showed nothing strange except a brief note about a mix-up in the nursery. The nurse corrected the tag on his bassinet after realizing 2 babies shared the same first initial. There were no further details. While they traced the credit card account, Dev focused on the lost fire photos. A retired investigator remembered that boarding house case. He said the original fire report mentioned a suspicious guest who checked in under a name, later determined fake. The guest paid cash and left nothing behind except a note in a shared kitchen, telling another tenant not to open a specific window. Hours later, flames erupted near that window. The retired investigator kept a personal copy of some documents. In those, Dev found a second composite sketch based on a bus driver's description. The sketch showed someone slightly older with a sharper jaw, who boarded a night bus heading east 2 days after the fire. Comparing that sketch to the most recent hotel footage produced the worst match yet. The bone structure looked almost identical to Riven's. At this point, people around him started joking nervously that he had a secret life. He laughed on the surface, but stopped sleeping properly. Every time he looked in a mirror, he saw the hotel lobby's still image in his head. He wondered whether he had medical issues, maybe blackouts, or dissociation he did not remember. Doctors ran tests, he checked clean on everything they tried. A break came when a technician reviewed audio from one of the bus stations where the mystery man had appeared years earlier. In the background of a ticket counter recording a clear voice requested a seat under the name Riven Malco. The voice did not only sound similar, it matched his speech patterns, his pauses, and his slight flattening of certain vowels. Audio comparison software rated the probability of a match as nearly identical to same speaker recordings. The one thing the other man never did was stay in front of a camera for more than a few seconds. In every clip, he looked up once, moved smoothly through the frame, then disappeared. No long conversations, no lingering in crowds, no hobbies, no regular routes. Only short transactions, matched to events that never quite reached the level of major crime, but always brushed the edge of some future investigation. Hotel parking lots later checked against his stays showed small overlapping patterns. In more than one case, a car with altered plates sat within view of the lobby door on the nights he checked in. That car never showed up in traffic cameras outside the property. The plate numbers did not exist in any registration. It appeared like someone deliberately wanted something weird preserved around him in case anyone examined the footage later. When reporters eventually learned pieces of the story through leaks, they called it a shadow identity case. They framed Riven as a man haunted by his own face. Some wanted to label the other figure a twin. Genetic swabs from his parents said otherwise. Specialists confirmed that if a genetically identical sibling existed somewhere, at least one marker in the tests should hint at shared origin. Nothing did. The investigation eventually lost official steam. Federal interest dried up when no major financial crime surfaced. The credit account closed after being tagged permanently as compromised. Yet Dev could not let it go. Off hours, he kept cross-checking random hotel and bus station footage using the old facial data. Months later, he caught a new match. The stranger appeared in a gas station camera in a completely different region, paying for fuel with cash. He looked exactly like Riven at that moment, down to a faint new scar across the chin that Riven received only weeks earlier when a jack slipped at the garage. Dev played the video for him. Riven watched himself from a different angle, standing in a place he had never visited, wearing clothes he had never owned, with his fresh scar visible in the reflection of the station's glass door. The footage lasted 6 seconds. That was the moment things quietly ended. No one reopened the official case, no one tried to explain how a stranger carried injuries that matched his timeline. Dev realized they had stepped into territory beyond standard reports. Anything they wrote might damage Riven's life instead of helping him. Rumors already swirled in the town. In the years since, smaller details surfaced like strange driftwood after high tide. A toll booth worker remembered a driver who looked like Riven but spoke with an accent from another region. A motel clerk mentioned a guest signing his name with the same flattened final stroke years before Riven first stayed there on routine trips. Each story remained too small, too scattered, to build into something prosecutable. Riven kept working at the garage and tried to live normally. He changed banks, limited travel, and refused to stay in hotels alone if he could help it. Sometimes he checked news from distant cities, scanning for odd stolen identity reports or fires in older buildings. He told no one that, occasionally, standing near reflective shop windows after hours, he thought he saw a half-step delay between his movements and his reflection. Whether those were nerves, glitches in glass, or something else, he never found out. Officially, the file sits closed as a cluster of fraud incidents tied to unknown actors. Unofficially, the officers who saw the footage still talk about the stranger who moved through different years wearing the same face, leaving behind pieces of old investigations like calling cards. It remains one of those stories that refuses to settle into a normal explanation, a quiet reminder that sometimes the most outrageous cases are not the ones with the loudest crimes, but the ones where reality bends slightly without ever quite breaking. This unbelievable tale sounded fake until evidence proved it. Locals once joked that the title fit a story no one believed at first, Yet investigators later admitted the evidence forced them to reevaluate everything. The center of the story was a 35-year-old field surveyor named Kalen Westridge, who worked for a small environmental firm that handled land assessments across several rural counties. He spent long days hiking remote valleys to mark boundary lines and catalog soil conditions. That morning, he planned a quick survey near an old creek bed scheduled for a future restoration project. He drove his truck toward the site shortly after sunrise and carried only a measuring pole, a tablet, and a compact camera. He told his supervisor he would check soil readings near the lower slope before moving uphill for a second sample. He expected to return before early afternoon. The weather looked cool and steady as he parked near a faded trailhead that had not been maintained in years. He stepped onto the narrow path and listened to water moving faintly downstream. The incident began when he reached the first sampling point and found a set of markers he did not recognize. 3 wooden stakes stood in a tight cluster, each wrapped with twine that held thin scraps of paper. He knelt to inspect them and saw faint lines drawn in graphite that resembled contour maps. None matched any known survey in his database. He photographed the stakes and planned to pack them out for documentation, yet he hesitated when he noticed the soil around them disturbed in a clean circular pattern. He followed the disturbed soil and found a shallow trench only a few inches deep. At its center lay a rusted metal tag stamped with the number 37. The tag design looked outdated for modern survey work. He tested a soil sample and noticed a strange mineral odor that did not match the creek's usual profile. His tablet refused to sync with the remote server, so he wrote a quick field note and continued toward the creek bend. The complication appeared when he reached the bend and saw an abandoned camp wedged between 2 leaning trees. A small canvas tarp covered a pile of gear that appeared soaked and weathered, yet the camp stove beside it looked clean. A dented cup rested on a flat stone. He touched it and found the metal warm even though no fire smoldered nearby. A notebook lay half open near the tarp, its pages warped by moisture. The first legible line read, "Someone keeps moving my markers every night." Kalen felt a knot tighten in his stomach as he flipped through the notebook. The entries described repeated tampering and odd calls heard in the early morning hours. One entry, dated 2006, read, "Saw a figure near the ridge, but tracks disappeared at the first curve." Another entry said, "Someone answered my call using my own voice." Kalen closed the notebook and listened to the quiet forest around him. A heavy stillness settled through the valley. He moved away from the camp and walked upstream to document additional points. Halfway along the creek, he noticed fresh impressions on a gravel bar. The impressions matched the tread from his own boots. He paused and checked his path. He had not walked that section yet. When he leaned closer, he saw the prints formed in a mirrored pattern, left and right reversed, as if someone deliberately copied his steps. He photographed them while his pulse climbed steadily. The investigation deepened when he checked a second gravel patch and found another pattern. These prints matched his boots exactly, yet pointed in the opposite direction from his current route. The spacing also matched his stride with uncanny precision. He scrolled through older messages on his tablet and noticed an unsent draft that he did not write. The draft read, "I found the old markers at the trench, and someone followed me from the ridge." He stared at the screen with rising confusion. Kalen backtracked toward the abandoned camp to re-examine the notebook. When he arrived, he noticed something different. The tarp now lay folded beside the stone, and the cup sat upright near the edge of the creek. The shift felt too purposeful to be wind. He called out, "Is someone here?" But only the murmur of the creek answered. He turned toward the ridge and saw a faint reflection on a branch, like sunlight glinting off metal. He moved carefully uphill to investigate the reflection and found a small handheld radio tangled in vines. The radio still held a weak charge. When he pressed the power button, he heard a faint recording that crackled through static. The voice sounded like a distressed hiker, repeating the words, "Keep your distance," with a strained tone. The second half of the recording repeated the same message in a lower voice that matched the cadence but not the pitch. Both messages ended abruptly. Kalen carried the radio to an open patch and attempted to reach his supervisor. The line triggered a slow, repeating static pulse that felt rhythmic rather than random. He waited for a clear gap and spoke. His own words echoed faintly through the speaker as if the device replayed them with a distorted quality. He shut off the radio and returned it to his pack. Something in the valley mimicked signals and possibly voices. He followed the ridgeline to gain perspective on the layout of the valley. From the high point, he noticed a series of old stone piles arranged in a rough arc. The piles aligned with the stakes he found earlier. He climbed down to inspect them and found a single metal hook partially buried in the dirt. The hook resembled the kind used to anchor early survey tripods. He scraped away soil and uncovered a second hook bent sharply near its base. He took photos from multiple angles and documented the spacing between the piles. A faint cry carried from the lower slope. It sounded like his own voice calling for help. He froze and waited. The cry repeated, this time with a slight delay and a broken syllable. He tried to locate the source, but the echo bounced between the trees. He forced himself to stay calm and descended toward the creek. The cry followed him in a strange looping pattern that did not match the terrain. The twist settled when he returned to the trench and found a fresh stake hammered into the soil. The stake held a strip of paper with a message written in shaky letters. The message read, "You left your mark near the ridge." The handwriting looked similar to the notebook, but less controlled. He reached for his camera to take a photo and noticed a new set of prints circling the trench. The prints matched his boots perfectly, yet formed in a pattern he could not have walked. Kalen backed away slowly and reached the open trail. He walked quickly toward his truck, fighting the urge to run. Halfway up the path, he heard footsteps behind him that matched his pace exactly. He sped up, and the footsteps sped up. He stopped, and the footsteps stopped. He turned around, but saw only still trees. He broke into a run and reached his truck with shaking hands. He locked the doors and started the engine. As he drove away, he glanced in the mirror and saw a figure standing near the faded trail marker. The figure wore a jacket similar to his and held one arm at the same angle he did. The posture looked like a reflection. The figure did not move. Kalen watched until the trees blocked the view and kept driving until he reached the main road. The evidence he submitted later included the notebook, the trench photos, the old hooks, the stake markers, and the strange recording found on the handheld radio. Analysts confirmed that the layered voice in the recording matched his cadence with high accuracy, even though the second voice drifted off pitch. The mirrored footprints also matched his exact boot pattern, including a small defect on the left heel. The button settled when the restoration project shifted to another region and the valley survey was postponed indefinitely. Kalen requested assignments away from isolated areas. People who reviewed the evidence said the story sounded fake when he first described it, yet every sample, recording, and footprint pattern supported his account. The case ended quietly, but the valley remained marked with details no one could explain. They said the story stayed unbelievable only until the evidence proved it. In this new story, 3 disturbing small-town horror stories. Part 1. The town where nobody locked their doors. Most people in the American heartland believe that absolute trust is a sign of a healthy and safe community. This account from a remote mountain village suggests that leaving your front door unlatched might be an invitation for disaster. In the isolated village of Blackwood Hollow, the local culture was built on the fact that no one locked doors. Harlan Reed was a 41-year-old postal carrier who walked the quiet streets of the hollow every afternoon. He had lived in the town since 1982, and he knew the specific habits of every single neighbor. The locals believed that their safety was guaranteed by the surrounding mountains and the long history of their shared ancestors. Harlan enjoyed the predictability of his route because it allowed him to finish his work before the early winter darkness. He often dropped off packages directly inside the mudrooms of the elderly residents who could not easily reach their porches. This level of trust was the foundation of the town, and no one ever questioned the safety of the practice. The atmosphere began to change during the first week of November in the year 2021 without any warning. Harlan was delivering a heavy box to a Victorian-style home owned by a woman named Mrs. Gable, who lived. He pushed the front door open as he had done for 15 years, but he felt a sudden and sharp. The house was silent, and the air inside felt significantly colder than the crisp autumn breeze blowing through the yard. He called out for Mrs. Gable, but his voice seemed to be absorbed by the heavy curtains and thick rugs. He noticed that the furniture in the living room had been moved into a tight circle facing the front door. This was strange because the elderly woman was known for her obsession with keeping her home in a perfect state. Harlan left the package on the floor and stepped back outside because he could not shake the feeling of. He mentioned the odd encounter to the local sheriff named Silas Thorne while they were eating lunch at the diner. Silas suggested that the woman was simply redecorating for the upcoming holiday season in the Hollow, but Harlan remained. By the middle of the following week, Harlan noticed similar patterns in several other homes along his daily delivery route. Doors were standing wide open even when the temperature dropped below freezing, and the residents were nowhere to be seen. He stopped at the home of a young mechanic named Elias Vance, who was usually working in his garage. The garage was empty, and the tools were scattered across the concrete floor as if they had been dropped suddenly. Harlan walked to the back door and found it unlatched and swinging slowly in the damp and heavy wind. He entered the kitchen and saw 3 plates of steaming hot food sitting on the small wooden table in silence. The family was gone, but the television was still playing a local news broadcast from a city 50 miles away. He felt a sense of vertigo as he realized the residents had not simply walked away from their homes. Harlan decided to conduct his own investigation because the authorities seemed disinterested in the strange behavior of the quiet town. He returned to the post office and began to look through the historical archives of Blackwood Hollow from many decades. He found a series of newspaper clippings that described a similar event that occurred in the winter of 1950. Several families had disappeared from their homes overnight, leaving behind open doors and half-eaten meals on their dining tables. The reports mentioned that the only witness was a young boy who spoke about a tall figure wearing a hat. This figure reportedly walked through the streets and knocked on every door that was not properly secured with a bolt. Harlan realized that the current residents were following a tradition that they did not fully understand or even remember. They left their doors open because they believed it kept them safe from the thing that wanted to enter. He spent the next 3 nights watching the main street from the window of his small apartment above the pharmacy. The town was deathly quiet, and the only sound was the howling of the wind through the dark mountain passes. On the 3rd night, he saw a dark shape moving slowly between the houses on the far side of town. The figure was remarkably tall and wore a tattered coat that seemed to blend into the shadows of the trees. Harlan watched in horror as the figure approached the front door of the local grocery store and pushed it open. The figure emerged a few minutes later and moved toward the next house with a purposeful and steady gait. The next morning, he went to the grocery store to see if the owner, named Arthur, was still there. Arthur was sitting in the middle of the aisle, staring at the ceiling with a look of pure and absolute. He did not respond when Harlan called his name or when he shook him gently by the heavy coat. Harlan realized that the town was being harvested by something that used the open doors as an invitation to enter. The residents were not being taken by force, but were surrendering to a force they could not possibly hope. He returned to his apartment and finally did the one thing that no one in the town had ever. He closed his front door and turned the heavy brass deadbolt until he heard a loud and satisfying click. The scratching started at exactly midnight and continued for several hours as the entity circled the small and dark apartment. Harlan could hear the heavy breathing of the thing on the other side of the thin wooden door in silence. It whispered his name in a voice that sounded like the rustling of dry leaves in a very deep. The deadbolt held firm, and the scratching eventually stopped as the sun began to rise over the cold mountain. He finally gathered the courage to open the door and walk out into the streets of the hollow once more. The town was completely empty, and there was no sign of the residents or the tall figure in the. The open doors were still swinging in the wind, but the houses were now hollow shells of their former selves. The police files confirmed that 100 people disappeared without a single trace of a struggle or a crime. Harlan Reed still lives in a city where every door is locked, and he never forgets the open doors. The mystery remains as deep as the woods and as old as the fear of the dark and the. This story serves as a reminder that some traditions are actually chains that bind us to a very dark. The silence of Blackwood Hollow is the only legacy left behind for those who chose to leave doors open. Part 2. Everyone heard screams. Nobody called the police. Most violent crimes happen in the shadows of the night when no one is around to witness the actual struggle. This story is different because it happened in the middle of a crowded neighborhood where every single person was listening. The bystander effect is a documented phenomenon where people fail to help when others are present in a large group. In the autumn of 2021, a small community in Ohio learned how dangerous this silence can truly be. Vance Whitaker was a 45-year-old retired machinery operator who lived in a brick apartment complex in Ohio. He liked the quiet nature of the suburbs because it allowed him to focus on his gardening and local woodcraft. On the night of October 12, 2021, he was sitting in his living room watching a classic film. The complex was designed with a central courtyard where residents often gathered to talk during the warm summer months now. At approximately 10 o'clock that night, a piercing scream echoed through the courtyard and vibrated against the thin glass windows. Vance paused his movie and looked toward the window, but he did not see any movement in the dark shadows. He noticed that the moonlight was casting long and jagged shapes across the brick walls of the apartment buildings tonight. He assumed it was just a group of teenagers playing a prank or perhaps a loud television in another unit. He waited for several minutes for a second sound, but the courtyard remained deathly silent under the dim yellow lights. The air was thick with the scent of damp leaves and the lingering smell of charcoal from a nearby grill. He decided to go back to his movie and ignored the nagging feeling that something was wrong in the complex. Another scream rang out 10 minutes later, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps running across the wet pavement below. Vance stood up and walked to his balcony, but he could only see the silhouettes of his neighbors looking out. No one was shouting for help, and no one was running outside to investigate the source of the terrifying noise. He saw the lights in the apartment across the way flicker on and then off as if someone was watching. Vance felt a sense of relief because he assumed his neighbors were already calling the police to report the disturbance. He sat back down on his worn leather sofa and tried to focus on the dialogue of the old film. The screaming stopped after 30 minutes and was replaced by the low hum of the wind through the courtyard trees. He went to bed shortly after midnight, convinced that the situation had been resolved by the local authorities already today. The next morning, he woke up to the sound of sirens and saw several police cruisers parked in the lot. Yellow crime scene tape was draped across the entrance to the courtyard where he had heard the screams last night. He walked outside and saw a group of his neighbors standing together with looks of deep confusion and mounting guilt. A detective named Silas Thorne began to knock on every door to ask if anyone had heard anything unusual recently. Vance told the detective about the screams and mentioned that he thought someone else had already called the emergency line. The detective looked at his notepad and informed Vance that not a single person in the complex had called them. There were 48 occupied units in the building, and every single resident admitted to hearing the screams that night. They all gave the same excuse that they assumed someone else would take the responsibility for calling the police now. The victim was a 30-year-old woman named Elena Vance, who worked as a night shift nurse nearby today. She had been attacked while walking from her car to the front door of her building in the open air. The investigation revealed that the attacker had stayed in the courtyard for over an hour because he knew no one. He had moved with a calculated slowness because he realized the neighbors were watching but doing nothing to stop him. The forensic team found several discarded cigarette butts near the bushes where the attacker had waited for his next move. The most disturbing part of the case was the realization that the screams were not actually coming from Elena Vance. The detective found a small digital recorder hidden in the bushes that was programmed to play a loop of screams. The attacker had used the recording to desensitize the neighbors and see if anyone would actually step outside to help. Elena had been taken in total silence while the neighbors were distracted by the loud and artificial noise in courtyard. The police found her car door wide open and her keys still hanging from the lock in the driver's side. The twist in the investigation came when they reviewed the security footage from a camera hidden in the lobby area. The man who planted the recorder was not a stranger, but a resident who lived on the third floor now. His name was Julian Reed, and he was a quiet 38-year-old accountant who never caused any trouble. He had spent weeks studying the habits of his neighbors to ensure that his psychological experiment would work perfectly today. Julian did not want to kill anyone, but he wanted to prove that the community was built on false trust. He had taken Elena to a nearby warehouse and left her there safely to show how easy it was. The police found Elena unharmed, but the psychological damage to the residents of the complex was permanent and very deep. Every person who lived in that building eventually moved away because they could no longer look at their neighbors' faces. Vance Whitaker left Ohio a month later and moved to a small cabin where he did not have any neighbors. He realized that the silence of the woods was much safer than the silence of a crowd of indifferent people. The case remains a chilling reminder that we cannot always rely on others to do the right thing in moments. If you hear a scream in the night, you should be the one who makes the call to the police. The ending of this story sounds fake, but the police records confirm the strange details of the social experiment today. Some people want to watch the world burn, and others just want to watch their neighbors do absolutely nothing now. Local psychologists often cite the Blackwood Hollow incident as the perfect example of how urban isolation affects our basic instincts. It remains a mandatory case study for university students who are learning about the complex nature of human social behavior. The recorded screams are still kept in a secure evidence locker at the police station as a grim historical artifact. People who move into the complex today are never told about the night that everyone listened to the darkness alone. Vance Whitaker sometimes looks at the old news clippings and wonders if he would do anything differently if it happened. The silence of the neighborhood was a choice that 48 people made together without ever saying a single word. The world is full of sounds, but the most important ones are often the ones that we choose to ignore. Part 3. The family everyone avoided. Most people who live in the rural corners of northern Maine understand that privacy is a very respected local tradition. There was one specific household on the edge of the woods that made even the most hardened loggers feel uneasy. Beckett Lowry was a 45-year-old carpenter who supposedly moved into the old Miller estate in the winter. He was joined by his wife Alara and their young daughter Maisie, who was rarely seen playing in the yard. The neighbors noticed immediately that the family never traveled into town to buy groceries or supplies like a normal family. They would only see the three of them standing at the edge of the dark forest during the late evening. The Lowry family stood perfectly still for hours while staring into the dense trees as if they were waiting there. No one in the small community ever dared to knock on their door or offer a warm welcome to the quote. The local mail carrier, named Arthur, was the only person who had any regular contact with the strange Miller property. He noticed that the grass in the front yard never seemed to grow despite the heavy rain of the spring. The windows of the house were always covered with thick black fabric that prevented anyone from seeing the interior rooms. In the summer of 1997, Arthur noticed that the mailbox was overflowing with letters and local circular advertisements. He walked up the porch steps and felt a sudden drop in temperature that made his skin crawl with dread. He looked through a small gap in the window fabric and saw the three family members sitting at the table. They were not eating or talking, but were simply staring at the front door with wide and unblinking pale eyes. Arthur dropped the mail and ran back to his truck because the silence from the house felt like a... He reported the strange incident to the local sheriff named Silas Thorne, who had been patrolling the area for years. Silas was a practical man who did not believe in local legends or the whispered fears of the nervous townspeople. He agreed to perform a welfare check on the Lowry family to ensure that no one was sick or hurt. The sheriff drove to the estate the following morning and found the front door was standing wide open and unlatched. He stepped inside the foyer and was immediately struck by the thick layer of dust covering every single piece of. It looked as if no one had lived in the house for at least 30 years despite the recent sightings. He walked into the kitchen and found the three family members sitting exactly where Arthur had described them the day. The sheriff approached Beckett Lowry and touched his shoulder, but the man did not move or respond to the contact. Silas realized with a shock that the bodies were not alive, but were perfectly preserved and very realistic wax figures. He searched the rest of the house and found a collection of old newspaper clippings hidden under the floorboards. The articles described a family named Lowry who had disappeared from a different state in the year 1967. The photographs in the newspapers matched the faces of the wax figures sitting in the kitchen with terrifying and exact. Silas found a journal in the basement that described a man who wanted to recreate his lost family forever today. The writer had spent decades building the figures and moving them around the yard to simulate a normal and living crumb. The neighbors had not seen a real family, but had been watching a grieving man move statues in the dark. The investigation revealed that the real Beckett Lowry had died of natural causes in the basement several months prior today. His body was found resting near a workbench filled with sculpting tools and various jars of heavy industrial grade. The mystery of why the neighbors saw the figures standing on their own remains a topic of local debate now. Some people believe the grief was so strong that it left a permanent stain on the old Miller estate grounds. The house was eventually torn down, but people still avoid the empty lot where the family used to stand. The forest is quiet now, and no one stands at the edge of the trees during the late evening hours. It is a reminder that the things we avoid are often much sadder than the monsters we usually imagine. The police files confirm that the Lowry family was never actually in the state of Maine during that time. In this new story, something followed them while camping. In the deep woods of the Cascade Mountains during July of 2024, a terrifying event reportedly changed 2 lives. Mark was a 28-year-old civil engineer who often looked for peace within the remote regions of the Pacific Northwest. He had spent years exploring the various trails of Washington state, and he felt very comfortable in the dense evergreen forests. His partner, Sarah, was a 27-year-old pharmacy technician who wanted to escape the stress of her daily office work. They had planned this specific trip for several months, and they were both excited to spend some time under the stars. The couple arrived at the trailhead early on a Friday morning while the mist was still clinging to the tall pine trees. They checked their equipment one last time, and then they began the long journey toward a high ridge overlooking a lake. Dispatch logs from the Forest Service show that they had registered their itinerary with the local ranger station before they started. The path was steep and narrow, but they made good time as they climbed higher into the rugged and wild terrain. They reportedly found a suitable campsite near a small stream that provided them with a reliable source of fresh and cold water. Sarah began setting up their small tent, while Mark gathered enough firewood to last them through the duration of the chilly night. The sun began to dip below the horizon, and the shadows grew long across the forest floor as they finished their work. They didn't see anyone else on the trail that day, and they believed they were completely alone in the vast wilderness. While they were eating their dinner by the fire, Sarah mentioned that she felt a strange presence looming just beyond the light. Mark scanned the dark perimeter with his high-powered flashlight, but he didn't see anything unusual among the thick trunks of the trees. He told her that it was likely just a deer, or perhaps a small bear foraging for food in the nearby brush. They tried to relax, but the oppressive silence of the forest made them feel increasingly uneasy as the night grew much colder. State records later indicated that the couple went to sleep around 11 o'clock, but their rest was interrupted by a rhythmic tapping. Something was reportedly striking the side of their tent with a light and persistent force that sounded like a thin wooden stick. Mark sat up and listened intently to the sound, but it stopped as soon as he reached for his tactical camping knife. He didn't want to alarm Sarah, so he stayed quiet while he stared at the thin fabric of the tent wall. The next morning, they found several small stones placed in a perfect circle around the cold remains of their campfire from the night. Sarah was certain that those rocks were not there when they had gone to sleep, and she started to feel very afraid. Mark tried to find a logical explanation for the circle, but he couldn't think of any natural process that would do that. They decided to keep their original plan and hike further into the mountains, despite the growing sense of dread that they felt. County files from 2024 note that the couple felt a heavy presence following them as they moved up the trail. Every time they stopped to rest, they would hear the sound of branches breaking in the thick woods about 50 yards behind. Mark looked back several times, but the dense foliage made it impossible to see if a person or an animal was there. They couldn't explain why whatever was following them stayed just out of sight while maintaining such a consistent and frightening pace. As evening approached, they reached a high plateau that offered a wide view of the valley, but they didn't feel any safer. The wind began to pick up, and the temperature dropped rapidly as a thick layer of gray clouds moved over the peaks. They set up their camp in a small clearing, and they made sure to keep their gear very close to the tent. Sarah reportedly saw a tall and thin shadow move behind a large boulder, but it vanished before she could point it out. Investigators never confirmed the identity of the figure, but archived notes suggest that someone might have been living illegally in those woods. During the middle of the second night, the couple was woken up by the sound of heavy breathing just outside their tent. Mark didn't hesitate this time, and he shouted loudly to scare away whatever was standing right next to their sleeping heads. He heard something scramble away into the darkness, but the sounds were bipedal, and they definitely did not belong to a bear. The two hikers didn't wait for morning to arrive before they packed their essential items and started the long descent back down. They left their expensive tent and their heavy sleeping bags behind because they were terrified of staying in that location any longer. Every step they took felt like a race against an unseen predator that was watching them from the safety of the shadows. They reportedly reached their car as the first light of dawn began to touch the tops of the highest trees in Washington. A subsequent search by the local authorities found their abandoned gear, but there were no signs of a struggle at the camp. State records show that the case was eventually closed due to a lack of physical evidence or any identifiable suspects in the region. Records conflict regarding the number of similar reports, but some locals claimed that several other hikers had vanished in that specific area. Mark and Sarah never returned to the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, and they don't plan on going camping ever again in life. Local county files from 2024 describe the physical state of the abandoned items that the search party recovered near the ridge. The tent had been neatly folded, but the poles were missing and the fabric had several small holes that looked like bite marks. Sarah's digital camera was found resting on a flat rock about 20 yards away from the original site of their base camp. The investigators found no images on the memory card, except for a single blurry photo of a dark shape among the trees. A detailed report from the state records suggests that the hikers were lucky to have escaped the wilderness without any physical injuries. The region where they were camping has a long history of unexplained disappearances that date back to the early 1980s. Dispatch logs show that multiple search and rescue missions have been launched in that specific area over the last several decades. Most of those cases ended without any resolution, and the missing people were never seen by their friends or their families. Mark reportedly struggled with night terrors for several months after the incident, and he often woke up feeling like he was being watched. He told his therapist that he could still hear the sound of the heavy breathing right next to his ear every night. Sarah decided to move to a different city because the sight of the nearby mountains caused her to have severe panic attacks. They tried to find answers by talking to other hikers online, but they only found more stories that were equally disturbing. Records conflict about whether the authorities ever interviewed a suspicious man who was seen wandering near the trailhead that same weekend in July. This individual was reportedly wearing a heavy winter coat despite the warm weather, and he did not have any hiking or camping gear. He disappeared before the sheriff's deputies could arrive at the scene to ask him about his presence in the national forest area. No one knows for sure what was following Mark and Sarah that weekend, but the evidence remains locked in a county file. The trail they followed was known as the High Ridge Loop, which covers over 20 miles of some of the most difficult terrain. Archived notes from the local hiking club mention that several parts of the trail are prone to sudden fog and very low visibility. Mark and Sarah had prepared for these conditions by bringing extra layers of clothing and a reliable GPS device for their navigation needs. They didn't anticipate that the main threat would come from something that was watching them from within the shadows of the trees. When the search party arrived at the campsite, they noticed that the surrounding brush had been cleared in a very deliberate and unnatural way. State records indicate that the branches were snapped at a height of about 7 feet, which is much higher than any local animal. The investigators also found a small pile of rusted metal objects that had been placed carefully near the entrance of the abandoned tent. These items included old tin cans and a broken pocket watch that appeared to be from the early part of the 20th century. County files from 2024 show that the sheriff was deeply concerned about the strange patterns that were discovered at the forest site. There was no sign of a struggle or any blood, but the overall atmosphere of the camp was described as being very malevolent. One deputy reported hearing a faint whistling sound coming from the deep ravine while he was collecting the hikers' belongings for the official report. He didn't find the source of the noise, but he later resigned from his position at the department due to a nervous breakdown. Investigators never confirmed if the strange items found at the camp belonged to a person who had been living in the woods for years. Some locals claimed that an old hermit had been seen near the lake, but no official records exist to prove his actual identity. The case remains open, and it is still discussed by many people who enjoy exploring the mysteries of the Pacific Northwest wilderness region. Mark and Sarah's story serves as a grim reminder that some things in the woods are better left alone and completely undisturbed. The pharmacy where Sarah worked eventually granted her a long leave of absence so she could focus on her mental health and her recovery. She spent many hours in therapy trying to process the events of that weekend, but the fear remained deeply rooted in her mind. Mark also found it difficult to return to his normal life, and he eventually sold all of his camping and hiking equipment online. They don't talk about that trip anymore because the memories are too painful and they only want to move forward with their lives. Dispatch logs from the night of the incident reveal that several other callers had reported seeing strange lights in the sky over the forest. These reports were never linked to the experience of the two hikers, but they add another layer of mystery to the entire situation. Some people believe that the forest itself has a way of manipulating the minds of those who dare to enter its deepest parts. Records conflict on this theory, but the fact remains that Mark and Sarah were changed forever by what they experienced in Washington. The final report from the county coroner's office mentioned that no physical crimes were committed during the duration of the couple's camping trip. However, the psychological impact of being stalked by an unknown entity is often much more damaging than any physical injury could ever be. State records from 2024 are now archived, and they are only available to those who have a very specific legal reason. The truth about what happened on that high ridge in the Cascade Mountains may never be fully known by the public or authorities. A local reporter attempted to investigate the history of the High Ridge Loop, but he found that many of the files were missing. He reportedly spoke to a retired forest ranger who claimed that the government had purchased several large tracts of land in that area. These state records were allegedly sealed for national security reasons, but no one could explain why a forest would need such high protection. The reporter eventually dropped the story after he received several anonymous phone calls warning him to stop his research into the local matter. Mark once told a close friend that he saw a face peering through the mesh of the tent during the second night of camp. He described the features as being very pale and sunken with eyes that seemed to reflect the light of the dying embers outside. Sarah reportedly didn't see the face, but she felt the weight of something heavy pressing against the side of her sleeping bag. They both agreed that the entity was not trying to help them, but was instead waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The trail has since been closed to the public due to a series of rock slides that made the path too dangerous for most hikers. Some locals claimed that the rock slides were not a natural event, but were instead caused by someone who wanted to keep people away. Investigators never confirmed these rumors, and the official state records simply cite the weather as the primary cause for the trail closure. The Gifford-Pinchot National Forest remains a place of beauty and mystery, but for some, it is a place of absolute terror. The county file from 2024 includes a series of photographs taken of the ground where the tent had been located. These images show a pattern of deep depressions that look like someone had been kneeling in the dirt for a long time. Investigators never confirmed what caused these marks, but they were certainly not made by any equipment that the hikers had brought along. Some locals claimed that this specific spot was known to be avoided by the native tribes who lived in the region. State records show that the case was officially moved to a cold status after 6 months of investigation yielded no new leads. The hikers tried to resume their lives, but the psychological scars were far more permanent than they could have ever possibly imagined. Sarah reportedly sold her house and moved to a city that was far away from any large forests or remote wilderness areas. Mark began to study the local history of the Cascades in an attempt to find some kind of peace or closure. He reportedly found several old newspaper articles that mentioned a similar incident occurring in the same general area back in 1982. Those records conflict with the official police reports of that time, which stated that the missing hikers had simply lost their way. However, the archived notes from the search team described finding the exact same circle of stones around the abandoned campfire. This detail was never released to the general public, and it remains a secret kept within the locked files of the county. The story of Mark and Sarah is a quiet but terrifying example of the unknown dangers that can lurk in our world. We like to think that we're safe when we enter the woods, but the truth is often much more complex and frightening. They don't have the answers they're looking for, and they likely never will find the truth about that cold July weekend. Sometimes the things that follow us out of the darkness are the things that we can never truly understand or explain away. In this new story, Washington's small town horror stories that locals never talk about. Sultan, Washington remains a quiet region where the dense evergreens often hide the heavy morning mist in the early fall. Local residents usually avoid discussing the specific events that occurred near the edge of the Skycomish River during 2015. Records from the county sheriff indicate that several calls regarding unexplained activity originated from a single remote property that year. Investigators reportedly found the circumstances surrounding the inhabitants to be highly irregular based on the available dispatch logs from then. The following account details the documented experiences of three individuals who encountered something they simply could not easily explain. 32-year-old Mark Miller worked as a local timber surveyor who spent most of his days deep within the woods. He lived in a modest cabin with his younger brother David, who was 24 and worked as a seasonal mechanic. Their friend Sarah joined them during the autumn months to help renovate the aging structure before the harsh winter arrived. The group intended to finish the exterior repairs quickly so they could enjoy the isolation of the Washington wilderness. State records show that Mark had lived in the area for nearly a decade without reporting any significant safety issues. They did not realize that their presence on the property had been noted by someone or something in the brush. The dense forest surrounding the property was comprised of ancient cedar trees that effectively blocked out most of the natural sunlight. Archived notes from a previous land survey conducted in 2010 mention that the soil in this region was unusually soft. Mark discovered several sets of deep indentations in the earth that did not match any known wildlife species in the area. Some locals claimed that the property had a history of trespassing issues involving people who lived off the grid nearby. Investigators never confirmed the identity of these individuals because the dense terrain made tracking nearly impossible for the local authorities. The three friends began to feel a distinct sense of being watched from the dark shadows of the towering trees. Dispatch logs from late September 2015 indicate that Mark called the sheriff to report a series of loud metallic bangs. He stated that the noises seemed to originate from the corrugated metal roof of the tool shed behind the main cabin. David reportedly inspected the area with a high-powered spotlight, but he saw no one standing in the immediate vicinity. A county file from 2009 describes similar reports of vandalism that were never solved by the responding patrol officers. Sarah noted in her personal journal that the atmosphere on the property had changed from peaceful to something quite oppressive. They decided to install several motion-activated lights around the perimeter to ensure their safety during the long and dark nights. State records from October 2015 showed that the local power grid experienced several unexplained surges, specifically in the Sultan area. Sarah reportedly found that all of the heavy kitchen appliances had been moved several inches away from the wooden walls. She told the investigators that she heard the sound of slow breathing coming from the other side of her door. Records conflict regarding whether there were any signs of forced entry found by the officers who arrived later that evening. Some locals claimed that the cabin was built on top of an old mining shaft that created strange acoustic effects. The group became increasingly paranoid as they realized that their physical environment was being subtly altered by an unknown force. Archive notes from the county coroner mention a discovery of several dead animals that were arranged in a perfect circle. Mark found these remains near the edge of the clearing where he usually parked his heavy-duty timber hauling truck. Investigators never confirmed if the animals had been killed by a predator or if they were placed there by someone. The county file from 2009 mentions that a previous resident had reported finding similar patterns in the high grass. David reportedly began to suffer from severe sleep deprivation because he heard the sound of footsteps on the porch every night. He described the noise as a heavy dragging sound that lasted for several minutes before fading away into the deep woods. Dispatch logs from November 2015 record a second call regarding a security breach in the lower level of the cabin. David reportedly found the heavy iron padlock on the cellar door had been snapped off with a pair of bolt cutters. He told the deputy that nothing appeared to be missing from the storage area, despite the door being left wide open. State records indicate that the officers found no fingerprints on the metal surface of the lock or the door handle itself. Some locals claimed that a group of transients was known to use the abandoned mining tunnels for shelter during the winter. Investigators never confirmed this theory because no one was ever located in the subterranean passages beneath the Sultan Forest area. Sarah reportedly captured a single grainy photograph of a figure standing near the tree line during the early hours of the morning. The image shows a tall and thin shape that appears to be wearing a dark hooded coat with no visible face. Archived notes from the sheriff department state that the photograph was too blurry to provide any useful evidence for a search. Records conflict on whether the figure was a physical person or simply a trick of the light among the tall trees. Mark decided to board up the lower windows of the cabin to prevent anyone from looking inside during the night. The three friends stopped leaving the house after the sun went down because the feeling of being hunted became too intense. The final entry in the county file from 2015 describes a massive disturbance that occurred on the 3rd of December. Dispatch logs indicate that a neighbor heard the sound of glass breaking, followed by several loud screams coming from the property. When the officers arrived, they found the front door standing open, and the interior of the cabin was in total disarray. State records show that a significant amount of blood was found on the kitchen floor, but no bodies were ever recovered. Investigators never confirmed the origin of the biological samples because the DNA profiles did not match any of the residents. Some locals claimed that they saw 3 people walking into the river, but these reports were never verified by the police. A massive search party was organized by the local community members who spent 3 weeks combing through the dense evergreen forest. Volunteers reportedly found a single piece of torn clothing that belonged to Sarah snagged on a thick branch near the river. State records indicate that the search was eventually called off due to the arrival of a severe winter storm that year. The investigators found several items of personal value scattered along a trail that led toward the highest peak in the region. Records conflict regarding whether the items were dropped in a hurry or if they were placed as markers for the police. No trace of Mark or David or Sarah was ever found despite the extensive efforts of the local search and rescue teams. The case remains unsolved in the archive notes of the Washington State Police as a mysterious disappearance with no clear motive. The property in Sultan was eventually sold to a private developer who demolished the cabin and cleared the surrounding forest area. County records from 2021 show that no further incidents have been reported on that specific piece of land since. People who live in the region still avoid the area near the Skycomish River when the heavy morning mist rolls in. They reportedly believe that some secrets are better left buried in the soft soil of the deep and dark Washington woods. The true fate of the 3 residents remains one of the greatest mysteries in the history of the small town. This "no way that's true" story turned out to be real. Most people in that small township thought the claim was a joke at first. A guy said his house kept calling itself from the future. Neighbors laughed, coworkers teased him, and even the deputy who filed the first report admitted he barely kept a straight face. Yet the evidence that followed forced everyone to rethink what they believed about ordinary nights in an ordinary place. The man who made the claim was 34-year-old line cook named Tarvin Pike. He lived alone in a narrow rental near a patch of quiet farmland. He worked mostly dinner shifts at a family restaurant and spent his late nights repairing old radios that he bought from yard sales. Friends described him as patient and self-critical, the type who checked door locks twice and kept spare batteries in every drawer. The call that started everything came on a bland Monday evening in early spring. Tarvin said he stood in his kitchen heating leftover stew when his cell phone buzzed with an unknown number. He let it ring once before answering with a cautious hello. A short burst of static followed, then a thin, distant voice asked whether anyone survived the blast. The voice matched his own. He froze and listened while the caller repeated the question. The words sounded strained and shaky. Something clattered near the microphone. Then the voice whispered that the hallway collapsed and smoke covered the ceiling. The line cut out abruptly with a sharp crack. Tarvin stared at the screen and noticed the number belonged to a landline. The area code matched his own township. He owned no landline. After several minutes of pacing, he called the number back. A recorded message told him the number was unassigned. He told himself that the voice only sounded similar because people often mishear phone audio. He convinced himself enough to sleep, though he checked every outlet before turning off the lights. The next day, he mentioned the call to a coworker who laughed and suggested a prank recording. That night, the same number called again. This time, the voice said the roof had shifted and something heavy blocked the back door. Tarvin recognized how frightened the voice sounded. He also recognized the slight tremor in certain phrases, the same tremor he developed under stress. The call ended with a gasp and a muffled thud. He saved the call log and contacted the sheriff office. A deputy named Lyra Mavon took the report and admitted it sounded unusual but harmless. She suggested number spoofing or recycled lines from a decommissioned system. She told him to ignore further calls unless someone threatened him directly. He agreed, even though his hands shook when he left the office. 2 nights later, the pattern escalated. The same number rang at nearly the same time. The voice whispered with raw dread, saying the air smelled like burning plastic and the floor cracked near the living room. Tarvin begged the caller to identify a location. The voice said the house address clearly, the same one he currently lived in. The line filled with static, then went silent. He dropped his phone and ran outside, expecting flames or smoke. The night air stayed calm and cool. His windows glowed faintly from the kitchen light. The roof looked intact. The siding remained unmarked. He walked around the property twice. Nothing appeared damaged. Yet the call kept echoing in his mind. The next day, Tarvin convinced a friend with basic tech skills to examine the call data. The records looked clean, with timestamps that matched his phone log exactly. The tracing app they tried showed the origin within a few dozen yards of his house. His friend shrugged and said glitches happen, but admitted he had never seen one this precise. On the following night, the call came earlier. The voice spoke with uneven breathing and said the power failed inside the house. Tarvin checked his lights. Everything worked normally. The voice continued, saying the ceiling snapped and dust poured down. Then it begged for help and said the fire moved too fast. The call ended with a drawn-out hiss. He contacted Deputy Lyra again and asked her to listen to the recordings. She visited his house after her shift and stood in his kitchen while he played the audio. She listened quietly with a deep crease forming between her eyebrows. She asked whether he used audio editing tools or downloaded anything unusual. He shook his head. She replayed one section where the voice shouted his own name. It sounded undeniably like him. She recommended placing a small audio recorder near the landline port, though the house had no active line. She reasoned that stray signals sometimes traveled along old copper wires even after disconnection. Tarvin agreed and positioned a recorder near the baseboard outlet that once held a phone jack. He also moved one near the breaker panel in case interference came through wiring. Nothing happened for 2 nights. Then, at 2:17 on a Thursday morning, the recorder near the old phone jack captured a soft, repeated tone. It sounded like a failing alarm, one rising pulse followed by a short pause. The tone played 5 times, then fell silent. "If you have impassives." Tarvin heard none of it in real time, but discovered it the next morning while checking the device. He showed the audio to Deputy Lyra, who admitted she heard something similar in old fire investigation files. She recalled a case where a faulty smoke detector emitted an identical pattern shortly before a kitchen blaze consumed a rental. She checked the old file number and noted the incident occurred 10 years earlier on the other side of the township. The mapping system displayed the old property number. It matched Tarvin's current address. The township rebuilt the rental after the fire, installing new drywall, new wiring, and upgraded alarms. The previous owner sold the renovated place to a developer who later sold it to a private landlord. Somewhere between those transactions, the fire history vanished from online records, though handwritten notes still existed in the archived box. According to those notes, One witness claimed to hear someone shouting inside moments after the alarm failed. Fire crews arrived within 7 minutes. They found no bodies and no sign that anyone lived there at the time. The following night, the call returned with more urgency. The voice shouted that heat warped the hallway and the roof sagged. It said sparks leapt from the breaker panel. Tarvin reviewed the call repeatedly and recognized a phrase he used often without realizing it, a way he said the word panel with a clipped vowel. It made his stomach twist. Late that night, he unplugged every appliance and cut the breaker intentionally. The house fell completely silent. He waited in the darkness with a lantern beside him. After 20 minutes, the air felt oddly heavy, like the temperature dropped slightly. Dust drifted from a ceiling vent. He convinced himself the vent simply needed cleaning. Then the same unassigned number called. This time, the caller sounded far away, barely audible through rising static. The voice said the living room window had blown inward and smoke covered everything. It coughed harshly and gasped for help. Tarvin shouted into the phone, but the voice barely responded. The call ended abruptly with the sound of something collapsing. He ran outside again and scanned the house. Everything looked solid under the moonlight. No smoke, no cracked windows, no shifting roof lines. Yet, while standing by the driveway, he smelled something faintly chemical, like scorched insulation. The scent dissipated quickly. He could not tell whether it came from his imagination or the breeze. He called Deputy Lyra from the porch. She arrived within minutes and stayed until after 2 in the morning. Together, they opened every cabinet, checked the attic hatch, and inspected the breaker panel. The wiring looked normal. No scorch marks appeared anywhere, yet both admitted hearing a soft ticking in the living room that neither could trace. The ticking stopped whenever they approached, then returned faintly when they stepped back. Over the next few days, the calls lessened and then stopped entirely. Tarvin recorded no further strange tones or voice messages. The air inside the house returned to its usual dry stillness. He slept lightly, though, expecting another late-night ring. A week later, an unexpected envelope arrived in his mailbox. The return address came from the state fire marshal headquarters. Inside the envelope sat a thin photocopy of an old report flagged strictly for archival review. The accompanying note said the office apologized for misplacing certain documents and wanted to provide complete history for any resident living in a structure rebuilt after a previous incident. The report detailed the blaze from a decade earlier. It included a timeline with approximate minutes for alarm activation, roof collapse, and smoke spread. The handwritten minute marks matched the timestamps of every call Tarvin received. Each message from the unknown number aligned with one stage of the original fire. One margin note even described a witness who thought she heard a man yelling his own name shortly before the front window shattered. Tarvin brought the report to Deputy Lyra, who read the timeline several times. She opened the audio clips and placed them side by side with the report. The correlation bordered on exact. She told him that if she submitted this as evidence, she would lose her job. She also said he should consider moving. He moved out within a month. The landlord never disclosed new tenants. The house sat dark for weeks before lights returned sporadically. Neighbors said they sometimes saw a figure in the kitchen window late at night, though no cars parked in the driveway. Deputy Lyra kept a copy of the recording logs in her desk drawer. Occasionally, she played them quietly at the end of her shift. Something about the voice felt caught between two moments, like hearing a call trapped inside a broken timeline that kept bleeding through the same walls rebuilt after a decade. The state fire records now show the rebuilt house as compliant and safe. The official file on the earlier blaze lists no casualties. Yet the calls received by Tarvin left behind something difficult to classify. They documented a person experiencing a fire in a house already rebuilt years earlier, speaking with a voice that matched someone alive in the present, calling from a number that technically never existed. Every analysis ends the same way. The logs were real, the timestamps were real, and the reconstruction of the earlier incident aligns too well to dismiss. It remains one of those quiet, unsolved events, the kind people whisper about when they stand near old wiring or creaking rafters. A story that should have been impossible, but left behind recordings that made one thing clear. It turned out to be real in every way that mattered, even if nobody could explain how. In this new story, the Cumberland wilderness went silent, then we heard it. The dense forests of the Cumberland Gap hold a history of strange occurrences that the local authorities rarely discuss. Gideon Thorne had spent nearly 30 years patrolling the deep woods of the Cumberland Wilderness near the quiet Kentucky border. The summer of 1997 was the hottest season on record, and the local wildlife had grown very restless. Gideon was 48 years old, and he oversaw a small team of rangers who focused on the southern ridges. His job required him to manage the safety of hikers who often underestimated the complexity of the ancient limestone caves. He carried a heavy radio and a notebook filled with the coordinates of every hidden spring in his large sector. A wildlife researcher named Beckett Sterling arrived at the ranger station during the first week of August to study birds. Beckett was 32 years old, and he specialized in bioacoustics, which is the study of natural forest sounds. He told the ranger he wanted to record the rare owls that lived in a remote valley called Blackwood Hollow. Gideon checked his permits and reminded the young man that the hollow was known for its unusually thick morning fog. Beckett just smiled, and he adjusted the straps on his large pack before heading toward the dark forest trail ahead. The ranger watched the researcher disappear into the tree line, and he felt a familiar weight of concern in chest. The first 5 days of the expedition passed without any major issues, and the weather remained remarkably clear and sunny. Beckett sent a brief radio check-in every evening at exactly 6 o'clock to confirm his location and safety. On the night of August the 6th, the radio remained silent, and Gideon could not reach the young man back. The ranger waited until the following morning before he organized a small search party to head into the Blackwood Hollow. They started their investigation at the last known coordinates that Beckett had provided during his final successful radio check-in. The searchers found the campsite tucked away in a grove of ancient hemlock trees that were covered in thick moss. The tent was still zipped shut, and all of the expensive recording equipment was sitting on a folding wooden table. Gideon noticed that the entire forest was eerily quiet, and not a single bird was singing in the morning light. There were no signs of a struggle, and the food supplies belonging to Beckett were still sealed in plastic bags. The search party expanded their perimeter, but they could not find any footprints or broken branches in the surrounding area. Gideon found a digital recorder that was still running, and he put on the headphones to listen to the print. The audio file started with the normal sounds of the forest, including the wind in the trees and distant owls. At exactly midnight on the recording, the woods went completely silent, as if someone had turned off a giant switch. The silence lasted for nearly 4 hours, and the only sound was the faint hum of the internal electronic components. Then a rhythmic tapping started to echo through the speakers, and it sounded like a person using a heavy hammer. Beckett could be heard whispering into his microphone about a large shadow that was moving through the trees near camp. He described a figure that was at least 8 feet tall, and it moved without making any sound on leaves. The researcher sounded terrified, and he said the creature was mimicking the sound of his own voice back to him. According to the recording, the being stood just outside the tent, and it repeated the exact words Beckett spoke. The final entry ended with a loud, metallic screech and the sound of something heavy being dragged across the ground. Gideon felt a chill go down his spine as he realized that the researcher was not alone in Hollow. The search party spent the next 3 days scouring every inch of the valley, but they found absolutely nothing new. Gideon decided to review the archived dispatch logs from the early 1970s to see if this happened before then. He discovered that 3 other researchers had vanished in Blackwood Hollow under the exact same circumstances during the summer months. Each case involved a period of total forest silence, followed by reports of strange voices echoing through the limestone caves. Gideon realized that the hollow acted like a natural echo chamber that could capture and repeat sounds for many years. He returned to the campsite one last time, and he began to tap on the nearby rock walls with shovel. He heard a human voice whisper his name from deep within the stones, and it sounded exactly like Beckett Sterling. The ranger followed the sound toward a narrow opening in the cliff face that was hidden behind a thick waterfall. He squeezed through the gap, and he found himself in a large cavern that was filled with old recording gear. The equipment was decades old, and it had been carefully organized by someone who knew exactly how it all worked. Gideon found a final journal entry from a missing ranger who had disappeared in 1974 near the hollow. The The writing described a group of beings who lived in the caves and used sound to hunt their human prey. These creatures could perfectly mimic the voices of loved ones to lure people away from their safe and marked trails. Gideon realized that Beckett had been tricked into following a voice that sounded like a friend calling for help. He saw a pile of bones in the corner of the cave that belonged to many different people, and the ranger managed to escape the cavern just as the rhythmic tapping started to echo through the dark stone walls. He ordered the entire Blackwood Hollow to be sealed off from the public, and he declared it a danger. The official report stated that Beckett Sterling had likely fallen into an unmarked sinkhole during a sudden and violent storm. Gideon knew the truth was much more unsettling because the mountain was still holding the voices of the lost hikers. He retired from the service a year later, and he moved to a quiet town where the ground was. The town of Blackwood tried to move on from the disappearance, but the residents never quite felt safe near the people started locking their doors at night, and they told their children to never repeat what they heard in woods. Gideon Thorne spent his remaining years studying the science of acoustics, and he tried to understand the mountain and its. He kept a copy of the final recording, and he often listened to the way the voice shifted and changed. Some people say that the observers are still out there, and they are still waiting for the next curious hiker. The legends of the Cumberland wilderness continue to grow, and more people report hearing voices in the high mountain air. Every August, the rangers notice an increase in the reports of rhythmic tapping coming from the deep limestone caves. They stay on the lower trails, and they never go into the hollow after the sun has set. The case remains open in the dusty files of the sheriff's office, but no new evidence has been found. The forest remains thick, and the secrets of the Cumberland Gap are buried deep within the cold gray stone. Gideon often wondered if Beckett was still in the cave, and if he was still calling out for someone. He knew that some mysteries are better left alone in the dark corners of the world, where the wind. The investigation into the recording gear revealed that the machines had been modified with parts that were not commercially available. This discovery suggested that the beings in the caves possessed a high level of technical knowledge about sound and physics. Gideon realized that the creatures were not just animals, but were a highly evolved species that lived in the dark. He spent his final days writing a book about the experience, but he never shared the most terrifying details with. He died in 2024, and he left his collection of audio tapes to the local Historical Society archives. The researchers who studied the tapes found that the voices in the background were actually speaking a very old language. It appeared that the beings had been living in the Cumberland Gap for thousands of years before the settlers arrived. This realization changed the way the community viewed the mountains and the legends that had been told for generations. The mystery of the Cumberland silence remains unsolved, and the files are still locked in the ranger station basement. The town of Blackwood remains a quiet place, but the residents always listen closely when the woods go silent suddenly. They know that the mountain has a memory, and it never forgets a sound that it has heard before. Silas Thorne occasionally visits the old trailhead, and he leaves a small offering of electronics or metal on the rocks. He says it is a way to acknowledge the power of the mountain and its silent and ancient watchers. Some people laugh at him, but others bring their own gifts to the edge of the dark and thick forest. The hollow seems to accept these items, and the number of disappearances has decreased significantly over the last few years. Beckett Sterling is remembered as a brilliant researcher who pushed the boundaries of what we know about the natural. His family still visits the park every year, but they never go near the valley where he was lost. They stand on the high ridges, and they listen to the wind blowing through the trees of the Cumberland. Sometimes they hear a faint voice on the breeze, but they know better than to follow the sound into. The Appalachian Mountains continue to stand tall, and they keep their secrets hidden beneath the canopy of the green trees. The story of the silent wilderness is a reminder that we are only temporary guests in an ancient world. Gideon Thorne once wrote that the woods do not belong to us, but to the sounds that live within. Every October, the people look at the mountains and they remember the night the Cumberland wilderness went completely and eerily. The final recording Gideon made before he left the service was a simple description of the silence in the forest. He said that the silence was not an absence of sound, but a presence that felt very heavy and dark. He believed that the mountain was a living record of every scream and every laugh that had ever happened. This theory was never proven, but it remains a popular topic among the local hunters and the forest rangers. The tapes from the hollow are now stored in a specialized vault to prevent any unauthorized people from listening. Many people have tried to find the entrance to the hidden cavern, but the cliffs have shifted over the years. It seems as though the mountain has moved the path to protect its secret from the people who live. Silas Thorne says that some things are not meant to be mapped or understood by those who do not belong. He still patrols the lower trails, but he never goes above the ridgeline after the sun has set. He knows that the observers are still there, and they are still waiting for the next voice too. The legend of the Cumberland Silence is a chilling reminder of the power of the strange and the dark. The mountain remains a silent witness to the history of the land and the people who have passed through. Every year, the fog rolls into the hollow, and the woods go quiet once again for a long time. In this new story, a missing hiker case that changed a small West Virginia town forever. Small mountain communities often keep their secrets tucked away in the dense woods until a single person goes missing suddenly. The quiet town of Blackwood sat right on the edge of the Monongahela forest, where the trees grew very thick. Silas Thorne had worked as a lead ranger for the National Forest for over 25 years in West Virginia. He knew every single acre of the rugged land, and he respected the dangers that lived within the deep shadows. The autumn of 1994 brought a sudden cold snap that turned the green leaves into brittle brown shapes. A freelance cartographer named Elias Vance arrived in the town during the first week of October to map the ridge. Elias was 28 years old, and he had a reputation for being extremely thorough with his topographical surveys lately. He checked into the Pinecrest Motel and told the manager he would be back before the first heavy snow. Silas met the young man at the ranger station to provide him with the necessary permits for the backcountry. Elias carried a heavy pack filled with expensive survey equipment and enough food to last him for at least 10 days. He planned to hike toward a remote area known as Dead Man's Drop, which few people ever bothered to visit. Silas warned him that the weather could turn dangerous quickly, but Elias just smiled and said he liked the solitude. The young man seemed very confident in his abilities, and he possessed a map that was incredibly detailed and old. Silas watched the cartographer disappear into the tree line, and he felt a strange sense of unease in his chest. The first week of the expedition passed without any issues, and the weather remained remarkably clear and quite sunny for October. Elias was expected to return to the town by the 20th of the month to submit his preliminary survey findings. When the 21st of October arrived without any sign of the young man, the motel manager contacted the authorities. Silas organized a search party consisting of local volunteers and several experienced deputies from the nearby sheriff office in town. They started their investigation at the trailhead where the old blue truck belonging to Elias was still parked and abandoned. The vehicle was covered in a thick layer of pine needles, and the interior appeared to be completely undisturbed by anyone. Silas found a set of spare keys hidden in the wheel well, and he opened the door to check the glove box. Inside, he found a journal that contained several entries about the unusual geological features of the northern ridge and the cliffs. Elias wrote that the compass readings in the area near Dead Man's Drop were becoming increasingly erratic and very difficult. The search party began the long hike into the wilderness, while a light rain started to fall from the gray clouds. They followed the marked trail for 3 miles before they reached the point where Elias had planned to go off. Silas noticed that the undergrowth in this part of the forest was unusually thick, and it looked very dark indeed. The searchers moved in a grid pattern, and they shouted the name of the missing man into the cold mountain air. They found the first significant clue near a shallow creek about 5 miles into the dense and very unforgiving mountain brush. A bright orange survey marker was tied to a low branch, but it had been shredded by something with claws. Silas knelt down to examine the damp ground, and he noticed several deep impressions that did not look like footprints. These marks were elongated, and they seemed to sink deep into the mud, as if the creature was very heavy. The search party pushed deeper into the wilderness as the sun began to dip below the jagged horizon of peaks. They reached the base of Dead Man's Drop just as a light dusting of snow started to coat the ground. One of the volunteers shouted when he spotted a dark shape huddled beneath a natural rock overhang near the cliff. It was the heavy backpack that belonged to Elias Vance, but the young man was nowhere to be found nearby. Silas approached the pack with caution, and he noticed that the straps had been sliced with a very sharp blade. The contents of the bag were scattered across the frozen ground, and it looked like someone had been searching through. Silas gathered the items, and he found that most of the food was still inside and neatly wrapped in plastic. The most important discovery was a small handheld cassette recorder that Elias used to take notes while he was working. Silas pressed the play button and listened to the voice of the young man as it echoed through the air. The early recordings were standard descriptions of rock formations and elevation changes that sounded very professional and quite calm indeed. However, the tone of the voice changed significantly on the final entry, which was dated October the 14th of that year. Elias sounded breathless, and he whispered into the microphone about a cabin that was not supposed to be on maps. He described a structure made of gray stones that seemed to blend perfectly into the side of the steep mountain. According to the recording, the cabin had no windows and the heavy wooden door was sealed shut with iron bolts. Elias said he heard a rhythmic tapping coming from inside the stone walls that sounded like a person using hammers. He decided to wait nearby to see if anyone would come out of the strange building before the sun set. The recording ended abruptly with a loud metallic clatter and the sound of heavy boots running over very dry leaves. The search party spent the next 2 days looking for the stone cabin, but they found absolutely nothing in area. Silas studied the topographical maps and realized that the coordinates Elias mentioned led to a sheer cliff face with no ledge. He returned to the site where they found the backpack and began to clear away the snow with his hands. He discovered a series of narrow grooves carved into the rock that looked like they had been made by fingers. These grooves led toward a hidden crevice in the mountainside that was barely wide enough for a man to enter. Silas squeezed through the opening and found himself in a small, natural cavern that felt surprisingly warm despite the weather. The walls were covered in charcoal drawings of the surrounding forest and detailed maps of the town of Blackwood below. In the center of the cave sat a pile of survey equipment that had been smashed into hundreds of pieces. Silas found a final notebook page tucked into a crack in the stone wall that contained a single sentence. It stated that the mountain was not made of rock, but of something that was still breathing and hungry. The search for Elias Vance was officially called off after a massive blizzard buried the entire ridge under snow. Silas spent his final days as a ranger reviewing the dispatch logs from the night Elias recorded his final message. He discovered that several residents of Blackwood had reported hearing a strange rhythmic tapping coming from the floorboards of homes. These reports were dismissed at the time as settling foundations or the sound of woodpeckers in the nearby forest trees. Silas realized that the tapping Elias heard in the mountains was the same sound that was haunting the town below. He revisited the cavern one last time before he retired, but the entrance had been sealed by a rock slide. The maps that Elias had drawn on the cave walls suggested that the mountain was slowly expanding toward the town. Silas noticed that the distances between the trees near the trailhead were slightly different than they were 10 years ago. It seemed as though the earth itself was stretching and moving in a way that defied all known laws of. The disappearance of the young cartographer remained a cold case, and the files were eventually moved to a dusty basement. The town of Blackwood tried to move on from the tragedy, but the residents never quite felt safe in homes. Every year, on the anniversary of the disappearance, the local sheriff noticed an increase in reports of strange tapping sounds. The town of Blackwood was never the same after the disappearance of the young man who came to Map Wilderness. People started locking their doors at night, and parents told their children to stay away from the edge of woods. Silas Thorne retired from the ranger service a year later because he could not stop thinking about the rhythmic tapping. He moved to a different state, but he still kept a copy of the final recording in a desk. Some of the locals claimed they saw a figure watching the town from the high ridges during the cold months. These witnesses described a tall man who carried a survey pole and moved with a strange and very jerky gait. No body was ever recovered, and the stone cabin remained a mystery that the mountain refused to give up. The disappearance of Elias Vance became a local legend that served as a grim reminder of the power of nature. Some things are simply not meant to be mapped or understood by the people who live in the world. The Monongahela forest continues to grow over the old trails, and the secrets of the ridge remain buried in time. Silas often wondered if Elias was still out there somewhere tapping on the stones of a cabin that lived. He knew that some mysteries are better left alone in the dark corners of the world where the wind. The case remains open in the dusty files of the sheriff office, but no new evidence has ever been. Every October, the people of Blackwood remember the cartographer who vanished into the Gray Mountain, and they stay inside. The forest grew thicker around the old ranger station, and the trail to Dead Man's Drop was eventually closed forever. Silas occasionally received letters from old friends in Blackwood who claimed the mountain was appearing closer to the town center. They sent photographs of the horizon that showed the jagged peaks towering over the rooftops in a very threatening way. Silas looked at his old maps, and he realized that the town of Blackwood was no longer where it started. The entire valley had shifted several miles to the north, according to the latest satellite imagery and the local surveys. He remembered the charcoal drawings in the cave, and he realized that Elias had been trying to warn the town. The breathing that the cartographer mentioned was not a metaphor, but a literal description of the earth beneath their feet. Silas finally burned the final recording and the notebook page because the sound of the tapping was becoming too loud. He spent his remaining years in a quiet house far from the mountains where the ground was flat, and the mystery of the vanishing hiker remains one of the greatest unexplained events in the history of the small town. People still whisper about the man who tried to map the heart of the mountain and found something else. The stone cabin is still out there waiting for the next traveler to stumble upon its cold and windowless walls. In this new story, home alone during a snowstorm, then someone knocked. The winter of 2018 brought a historic blizzard to the Catskill Mountains that stranded many residents for several days. 24-year-old Emily Vance was a freelance graphic designer who had rented a remote cabin to finish her work. She reportedly planned to stay for 14 days, but a heavy snowstorm began to bury the house on the third night. According to dispatch logs from the Sullivan County Sheriff, she made a call regarding an unidentified visitor late that same evening. County files from 2018 indicate that the cabin was located miles away from the nearest neighbor in a dense forest. Emily had stocked up on supplies because she didn't want to leave the property until her big project was finally finished. The electricity reportedly failed around 10 o'clock at night as the wind speeds reached 50 miles per hour outside the cabin. She used a small kerosene lamp to light the living room while she listened to the sounds of the heavy wooden structure. A state record mentions that the temperature inside the home dropped to 40 degrees within just a few hours of the outage. Emily was huddled under several blankets when she first heard a soft, rhythmic tapping against the heavy oak front door that night. She initially dismissed the sound as a tree branch because the storm was shaking the entire foundation of the small mountain cabin. However, the knocking became much louder and more deliberate, as if someone was trying to get her attention through the thick wood. Dispatch logs from that evening show that Emily called the local authorities at exactly 11:22 to report a suspicious person. The operator reportedly told her that no patrol cars could reach her location until the snowplows cleared the main access road. Emily grabbed a heavy kitchen knife and moved toward the window to see if anyone was standing on the covered front porch. The glass was completely covered in thick frost, which prevented her from seeing anything beyond the blurry reflection of her own face. The sound of the knocking suddenly moved from the front door to the back of the house near the small kitchen area. Emily reportedly felt a sense of dread because the back door was much thinner and the lock wasn't as secure as before. She stayed in the middle of the room because she didn't want to be near any of the large glass windows or doors. The operator could hear the sound of something heavy hitting the side of the house while Emily was still on the phone. State records describe this sound as a blunt impact that was strong enough to shake the kitchen cabinets and rattle the plates. Archived notes from the following investigation state that the knocking continued for nearly 20 minutes without any verbal response from outside. Emily shouted through the door, but she didn't hear any voice over the sound of the wind screaming through the frozen trees. Some locals claimed that a drifter had been seen walking along the highway several miles south of the cabin earlier that day. Investigators never confirmed the identity of this individual or if they had the equipment to survive in such a brutal winter storm. The state records indicate that the footprints found later were far too large to belong to any of the local forest residents. Records conflict regarding whether the front door had been tampered with or if the locks were simply frozen shut from the ice. Morning light revealed a strange scene that the investigators would later document in a detailed county file from 2019 for court. There were no human footprints in the deep snow surrounding the cabin, despite the clear reports of someone circling the entire perimeter. Instead, the search team found deep circular indentations in the ice that didn't match any known footwear or local wildlife in New York. Some locals claimed that the pressure of the frozen ground can sometimes create unusual patterns during a very rapid change in temperature. Investigators never confirmed this theory because the marks were concentrated specifically around the entry points of the remote mountain home during the storm. Archived notes from the lead detective suggest that someone might have used stilts or another device to avoid leaving recognizable human tracks. The investigation turned to the history of the property, which had been built on an old logging site from the 1950s. County files indicate that the land had been the subject of many legal disputes regarding the boundaries of the neighboring state park. A state record from 2012 mentions a similar incident where a previous tenant reported hearing rhythmic knocking during a heavy rainstorm. Some locals claimed that the cabin was built over a natural vent that produced strange acoustic effects when the wind was strong. Investigators never confirmed if the sound of the knocking was a physical person or just a very rare environmental phenomenon of nature. Records conflict about whether the previous tenant had actually seen a figure standing in the woods before they decided to move out. Emily decided to leave the cabin immediately after the roads were cleared because she didn't feel safe staying there any longer alone. She reportedly told the investigators that she felt like someone was watching her from the tree line as she packed her car. Dispatch logs from the following week show that she called once more to report a strange vehicle parked at the gate entrance. When the deputies arrived, they found a set of archived notes sitting on the passenger seat of an abandoned and rusted truck. These notes belonged to a former surveyor who had disappeared in the same region during a similar winter storm in 2011. State records describe the surveyor as a very experienced man who knew the mountain trails better than almost anyone else in the county. The discovery of the abandoned truck led the investigators to believe that the two cases might be connected by a single individual. However, there were no signs of life inside the vehicle, and the engine had been cold for at least several months already. Some locals claimed that they had seen the old truck moving through the woods at night without any of its headlights turned on. Investigators never confirmed these sightings because the mechanical condition of the vehicle made it impossible for it to be driven by anyone. County files from 2019 show that the truck was registered to a man who had passed away over 10 years earlier. This data conflict caused a lot of confusion for the detectives who were trying to find a logical explanation for recent events. Emily moved back to the city, but she reportedly continued to have nightmares about the rhythmic knocking on the heavy oak door. She couldn't forget the way the house shook or the feeling that something was trying to find a way inside the warm cabin. Dispatch logs reveal that several other residents in the Catskill Mountains reported similar sounds during the remainder of the winter of 2018. Every report mentioned the same pattern of knocking, followed by a period of silence and then a heavy blow against the walls. State records never identified a suspect or a group of people who might have been responsible for these strange and terrifying events. The case remains an open file in the county office because the physical evidence doesn't support a clear conclusion for the record. The archived notes from the surveyor's truck contained several maps of the region with specific locations marked with a small red circle. One of these circles was located exactly at the coordinates of the cabin where Emily had been staying during the winter blizzard. State records indicate that the surveyor was investigating reports of strange ground vibrations that were occurring deep within the mountain forest area. He reportedly believed that these vibrations were caused by a hidden geological feature that had never been properly documented by the government. Some locals claimed that the sounds were much more frequent during the winter months when the ground was frozen and the air thin. Investigators never confirmed the existence of any such feature because the terrain was too dangerous to explore with the heavy drilling equipment. County files from 2020 include a summary of the forensic evidence found on the exterior of the mountain cabin after the snow. The siding of the house showed signs of being struck by a flat object with a surface area of approximately 4 inches. These marks were located nearly 7 feet above the ground, which is much higher than a person could reach without a ladder. Dispatch logs from the search team mention that no ladders or large tools were found anywhere on the property during the sweep. Investigators never confirmed if the marks were made by a tool or by a biological entity that possessed a very high reach. The state records focus on the possibility of falling ice chunks from the roof, but the pattern of the marks was consistent. Emily's lawyer reportedly requested a copy of the archived notes to see if there was any mention of a specific person nearby. The county files mention a recluse who lived in a cave system several miles away, but he had a very solid alibi. Records conflict regarding the exact location of this individual during the night of the blizzard when the knocking first began at door. Some locals claimed that the recluse was a peaceful man who didn't have any reason to harass a stranger in the winter. Investigators never confirmed his involvement, and he eventually stopped cooperating with the local sheriff's department after the first few rounds of questioning. The lack of a clear suspect made it impossible for the state to file any formal charges in the case of Emily. A final review of the dispatch logs from 2018 revealed a third call that had been dropped due to poor signal. In this short recording, Emily sounded much more panicked, and she mentioned seeing a shadow moving across the frosted glass of window. She reportedly said that the shadow was too thin to be a person, and it seemed to glide rather than walk on. Investigators never confirmed the presence of such a figure, and they attributed the sighting to the high stress of the dangerous situation. State records indicate that the cabin was sold later that year to a developer who planned to tear it down and build. The new owner reportedly found a collection of small stones arranged in a circle on the porch after the first light snow. These stones were perfectly smooth, and they didn't match any of the rocks found in the immediate vicinity of the property. County files from 2021 state that the new owner decided to abandon the project and sell the land back. He didn't provide a specific reason for his decision, but he mentioned that the atmosphere of the forest felt very unwelcoming. Some locals claimed that the mountain has a memory of the things that have happened there over the many long years. Investigators never confirmed these claims because they don't deal with the legends or the local folklore of the rural mountain regions. The archived notes from the original case are now kept in a secure storage facility in the city of Albany for reference. Emily now lives in a high-rise apartment building in a different state, where she feels much safer behind layers of security. She still checks the locks on her doors every single night before she goes to bed because she can't forget sound. Dispatch logs from her new neighborhood show that she has never called the police since she moved away from the Catskills. However, she reportedly keeps a small lamp burning in the hallway to remind her that she is no longer alone in dark. State records from New York show that the cabin was eventually reclaimed by the forest as the roof collapsed under snow. No one has lived on that specific piece of land since the events of 2018 when the knocking began during storm. The state records from 2022 describe a discovery made by a team of scientists who were studying the soil. They found a series of metallic fragments buried near the foundation of the old cabin that were composed of a rare, archived notes from the laboratory state that the fragments showed signs of extreme heat exposure despite being buried in the ground. Investigators never confirmed where the metal came from or if it had any connection to the sounds Emily heard during blizzard. Records conflict about whether the fragments were part of an old industrial machine or if they belonged to something much more. Some locals claimed that the area had been used for clandestine military testing during the 1970s, but this was never verified. County files indicate that the metallic fragments were located exactly beneath the spot where the heavy knocking had been reported by tenant. The soil in that specific area was reportedly devoid of any life, including the typical insects and fungi found in forest. Dispatch logs from the environmental team record a sense of unease as they worked near the ruins of the collapsed cabin. One of the scientists reportedly mentioned that his electronic sensors were malfunctioning whenever he approached the center of the old building. This data conflict led to a temporary halt in the research project until the equipment could be properly shielded from interference. Investigators never confirmed the source of the magnetic field that was causing the sensors to display such erratic and unpredictable data. The archived notes from the surveyor who disappeared in 2011 were re-examined by a specialist in the state police. These notes contained a drawing of a strange structure that he had found hidden deep within a narrow crevice in rocks. The drawing depicted a series of metallic poles that were arranged in a pattern that looked remarkably similar to the indentations. Some locals claimed that they had seen similar poles while hiking in the more remote sections of the mountain forest years. Investigators never confirmed the existence of this structure because the surveyor had not provided the exact coordinates in his personal. State records from 2023 show that the case remains officially unsolved despite the new evidence found by research team. The mystery of the knocking during the snowstorm of 2018 continues to haunt the people who live in Catskills. Dispatch logs are still analyzed by amateur investigators who believe they can find the one detail that the police managed to overlook. Every winter, when the snow begins to fall and the wind starts to howl, residents are reminded of the story. They reportedly make sure to check their locks and stay away from the windows when they hear a tapping sound. County files from 2024 list the area as a restricted zone due to the potential dangers of terrain. Investigators never confirmed if the danger was purely physical or if there was something else that the state wanted hidden. The most unbelievable true story I never thought I'd tell. People who knew the main subject of this story said he never wanted it shared, yet the title came from his final written note in a sealed incident report. The story centered on a 40-year-old technician named Latham Royce, who worked for a regional utility company that serviced rural counties with long miles of aging power lines. He preferred quiet schedules and predictable routes, and he kept to himself outside of work. That day, he planned a routine inspection run toward a hillside substation that often suffered weather damage. He left his small office building shortly after sunrise and loaded his truck with standard tools and a handheld meter. He told dispatch he would check the substation, inspect a few nearby relay posts, and return before mid-afternoon. The weather looked clear and the roads felt familiar. Latham enjoyed the quiet drive because early routes rarely involved complicated repairs. He parked near the substation gate and listened to the hum from the transformers as he prepared his gear. The incident began when he walked toward the main relay cabinet and noticed the lock hanging open. The padlock sat on the ground as if placed carefully rather than dropped. He knelt to check for damage and saw faint scrape marks on the metal that suggested someone tried forcing the latch recently. He photographed the cabinet for documentation and radioed dispatch to report tampering. When no reply came, he assumed the signal dipped behind the hill and continued inspecting the site. He opened the cabinet and saw a thick strand of wire removed from its proper mount and laid across the bottom in a strange curved pattern. The wire showed no arc marks or heat damage, which ruled out common electrical faults. He traced the pattern with his eyes and realized it resembled a shaped track rather than loose wire placement. He took another photo and noted the direction of the curve in his log. The surrounding gravel showed footprints that did not match his boot style. The complication deepened when he followed the footprints toward a ridge behind the substation. The prints ended near a small patch of ash on the ground. The ash pile looked too neat and dense for normal debris. He used a small metal probe to lift a fragment and realized it came from burned paper. A partially intact corner displayed faint grid lines consistent with utility schematics. He searched the area and found a second fragment with the letters RO faintly visible. Latham felt uneasy because missing schematics indicated a serious breach. He stepped farther into the brush and found a small metal tag half buried under leaves. The number on the tag matched an older transformer once listed in a unit that had been replaced years earlier. He placed the tag in a sample bag and photographed the location. He sensed someone had walked the ridge recently. The branches along the narrow path leaned in one direction and showed fresh breaks. He radioed dispatch again, but only heard static. He climbed the ridge to get better reception and paused at the highest point. From there, he noticed a narrow service road that did not appear on his current map. The road looked recently used because tire grooves cut through the dirt with crisp edges. He followed the grooves for several yards and found a broken reflector post lying beside the path. The brake marks looked clean enough to be recent. A damp paper scrap fluttered between the weeds. He picked it up and saw part of a handwritten note. Only 3 words remained. Leave it covered. The ink smudged near the corner. He checked his surroundings and listened for movement. A metallic clink echoed from further down the hidden road. He walked cautiously and saw a relay junction box standing open with the cover resting neatly against a stump. Inside the box, he found a laminated tag that did not match any current company design. The investigation grew more complicated when he returned to the substation to run a full diagnostic check. His handheld meter showed healthy readings at every point except one large grounding conductor that displayed inconsistent spikes. The spikes resembled intentional interference rather than random fluctuations. He traced the grounding conductor to an old anchor point near the fence line. The soil around the anchor looked recently disturbed and darker than the surrounding dirt. He crouched to examine the soil and spotted a folded sheet tucked between 2 rocks. He pulled it free and realized it was a partially burned maintenance log from 1998. The log listed several relay inspections performed by a technician whose name he did not recognize. The final entry read something about a pattern found near the ridge and an instruction to secure the record until further review. No follow-up pages existed. Latham checked the substation perimeter again and noticed a small camera housing tucked near the base of a transformer that should not have had any surveillance attached. The housing held no active components. It was only a shell, yet someone had placed it deliberately to resemble a working device. Inside the shell, he found a cut strip of metallic tape containing faint impressions, like someone pressed a thin tool against it. He photographed it and stored it in his pack. He returned to the ridge with renewed caution. The tire tracks on the hidden road continued toward a section where the dirt thinned and revealed old concrete remains from a small demolished shed. Under a slab, he found another ash pile containing char marks consistent with burned notebook bindings. He collected samples and recorded the time. He noticed a torn binder ring half sunk into the soil. The ring held tiny flecks of paper around its hinge. As he moved past the slab, he heard a sound that made him stop. Someone called his name from the direction of the service road. He froze. He had not told anyone his location except dispatch, and dispatch never responded to his earlier calls. He waited for movement and called out who was there, but the voice did not answer. Instead, another metallic clink echoed across the clearing. The sound came from behind him this time. He turned quickly and saw no one. He stepped toward the road and heard his name again. Same tone and same distance. He felt his throat tighten because the voice matched his supervisor's voice almost perfectly. He tried the radio once more, but only static returned. He walked backward toward open ground while scanning the trees. The forest looked undisturbed, yet the voice repeated his name in the same calm tone. The timing felt off because the voice never shifted in volume or direction. Latham hurried to his truck and locked the doors. He started the engine and drove toward the main road. As he pulled away, he saw a figure standing at the ridge overlook. The figure wore a light jacket similar to the standard issue for his company. He slowed briefly to look. The figure never moved. The posture looked rigid and the face remained shadowed by the sun angle. He accelerated down the road until the figure vanished from view. Later that afternoon, he filed an incident report at the regional office. He provided photos of every detail: the curved wire pattern, the burned schematics, the old log page, the unusual tracks, the missing camera interior, the mysterious voice. He expected immediate follow-up, but the report moved into a restricted folder by the next morning. A supervisor told him to treat the event as a misunderstanding caused by outdated equipment and environmental interference. The twist arrived when an older technician approached him privately 2 days later. The man said he remembered a similar incident in 1998 involving unexplained interference and missing documents. He recalled a technician named Rourke who left the company suddenly after reporting a pattern near the ridge. The man said Rourke claimed someone else had spoken his name during the inspection, even though no one else was present. Latham checked archived notes and found a redacted summary describing a suspended review connected to the old substation. The summary listed several missing logbooks and referred to an unknown visitor observed near the ridge. The entry ended with a directive to discontinue further field checks of that area without written approval. Latham realized the burned papers matched the missing logs. He no longer doubted what happened at the ridge. Someone had tampered with the site long before his visit, and someone continued observing technicians who inspected the area. The voice that called his name likely came from a recording device or a hidden repeater used to lure him closer. He felt grateful he left as soon as he did. He added a final handwritten note to the report before sealing it. The button settled when Latham requested reassignment to a different region. He told a few close friends that he did not want that story shared, yet he felt relieved someone finally documented the evidence. He never again returned to the ridge. People who read the archived notes said his final line explained the title perfectly. He wrote that it was the most unbelievable true story he never thought he would tell.